The blizzard of snow whirled in a wild dance, hitting the walls of the gloomy castle. In front of the window there was a table, and on it, on a small plate, rested a sandwich made with 2 slices of stale bread and jam. As he approached, the young woman took a box of matches from her pocket, and he turned one on, taking the plate with the food, and putting out the match. Hani congratulated herself on her birthday. I was alone in that castle, and I was desperately fighting to survive. And today I turned 19 years old. But even now on this day, other people outside were waiting for the girl to die. That day was etched in his mind, and left deep wounds in his heart. At that time, Emperor Frederick ordered Hani to be transferred to McLeod Castle, but people considered that punishment too compassionate, remembering how her mother tried to poison the Empress. In addition, at that time, they lost the imperial grandson she was expecting. Therefore, the people began to beg His Majesty to annul the order and reconsider the severity of the punishment. With a withering look, Frederick ordered everyone to be quiet immediately, promising that, otherwise, he would send them together with Hani to the castle. Locked down in the freezing cold McLeod Castle was practically a death sentence. Frederick considered it the best alternative to his sister's execution, even though she hadn't actually done anything. The castle, surrounded by an eternal winter, was on the top of a snowy mountain. That mountain, which was previously full of vegetation, froze about 500 years ago. At that time, the emperor of that time defeated a dragon that possessed ice magic. When the imperial sword pierced through the dragon's heart, an incredible strength was released. He froze the mountain in an instant, which caused the villagers to laugh. They were covered with ice and caused hundreds of casualties. Even after 500 years, the forest has not changed, preserving the horror of that incident, as if it had happened yesterday. But not only had Hani been banished there, to his horror, he somehow ended up acquiring the power of the dragon. The girl sat on the floor, resigned, thinking that her life was simply horrible, and that, if there was a god, she would never allow such a thing. I didn't know what else to expect from a life in which I couldn't feel a pinch of heat. Putting her hand over her heart, the protagonist burst into tears, convinced that people cannot live without warmth, and now, with the only thing she had left, she decided to commit her first sin, creating several ice spears in the air. The girl closed her eyes and got ready. A second later, lying in a pool of her own blood, for the first time, she felt a pleasant warmth, and if there really was someone who could listen to her in that place, Hani just wanted to be born in a less cold place. Suddenly, the protagonist opened her eyes, and found herself on a bed. Jumping up and bringing her hands to her head. In front of the bed was Hani's mother, Eleonora, who was screaming angrily at her daughter, thinking that she was useless. The protagonist thought that maybe they were memories before she died, but why just that moment? Without stopping screaming, the woman came to the table and took the girl's music box. As he smashed it to the ground, he decided that people like Hani should never have been born. The protagonist sighed bitterly, still not understanding why it had to do with just that. Her mother screamed that every time she saw her daughter, she felt like she was walking through hell itself. Eleonora had been empress, but even that title did not satisfy her, and she soon fell into decay. After Frederick's coronation, the woman found herself cornered, and vented all her fury on the baby. As a child, Hani believed that everything was her fault, so she kept silent and endured without making a sound. And now, finding herself there again, she realized how naive she had been. Seeing that her daughter was pensive, Eleonora became even more enraged. As he approached her, the mother rolled her eyes furiously, completely beside herself with rage, hitting Hani in the face. She was surprised that even such a creature would consider her a joke. At that moment, the girl was very surprised to feel the pain on her cheek after the blow. Starting to doubt whether she had really died, the protagonist suddenly felt a familiar force in her heart. Looking at his hand, he saw a blue glow gently enveloping his palm. Realizing that he had returned to the past, and also had ice magic, Hani was shocked. Eleonora was standing behind, looking angrily at the girl, who was not even paying attention to her. So, the woman concluded that even a useless one like her daughter was looking over her shoulder. Looking back, Hani thought that if this was her punishment, it was too cruel. Meanwhile, a little boy with golden hair and eyes was walking next to the royal palace. When he looked to the side, his eyes fell on something that left him confused. Shortly before that, Hani remembered how the maids brought a music box that Her Majesty had given her. Eleonora thought Frederick had gone crazy for deciding to give the princess something. In front of the girl, she put that music box on the table in her room, waiting for it to be night, and making sure everyone was sleeping. Hani sneaked up on the gift, turning on the music box. He enjoyed the pleasant sounds that he had never heard since he was born, and now, that gift was in pieces, right in front of the girl. The mother ordered him to stay quietly in his room until the wounds were healed, and if Hani dared to go out, it would be at his own risk. However, Eleonora was sure that even if her daughter wanted to, she would not have the courage to leave the room. After that, he began to leave the room, leaving the girl alone with her thoughts. Annie couldn't understand why she put up with that, and why she's still putting up with it until now. Leaving the room with complete calm, Eleonora suddenly noticed how the princess was quickly sliding to her side. At the same instant, Hani abruptly pushed his mother, causing her to fall and hit herself painfully. While the woman and her servants were recovering from the shock, the girl ran out through the corridors, calling for help. A few seconds later, Hani heard her mother's scream behind her, ordering her to be caught. The wounds on the princess's body were still hurting, and the girl did not know where to run. He remembered that, when he lived in the snowy mountain, the emperor was the only one who gave him everything he needed. Understanding that only he could help her now, Hani turned towards Frederick's quarters, but suddenly, female hands held her from all sides, filling the protagonist with terror. The maids were happy to have finally caught the runaway princess, and planned to take her to her mistress. One of them was shocked by how fast the girl could run. Even being in that state, the little girl wanted to scream for help, but suddenly they covered her mouth with their hand. Another maid reminded her that if Hani behaved well, Her Highness the former Empress would forgive her. The protagonist understood that if she was taken now, that would definitely be the end. For a second, the girl came up with the idea of freezing the maids with her skill, but he immediately stopped, not wanting to become a monster. Even if he had that power, she tried to scream again, but the girls covered her mouth and began to take her away by force. Suddenly, Hani saw around the corner a little boy with golden hair and eyes, who was in shock from what he saw. It was Oswald, the son of the current emperor, who could tell his father everything. However, he was paralyzed with fear. While the maids kept dragging the girl back to the room, drawing strength from where she did not have, Hani tried to scream and ask for help, but all to no avail. It only remained for him to hope that the boy understood everything well, and went to tell his father immediately. Already out of energy, the protagonist almost collapsed in the girl's arms, looking at Oswald pleadingly. The boy was looking back at her, completely confused by what was happening. The maids informed the lady that everything had gone smoothly, and that they did not run into anyone. Eleonora didn't care who got in here, because none of this would get to Frederick's ears anyway. Furious, she looked at her daughter, whose attempts had been futile. What bothered the woman the most was that that brat dared to push her and run away. She decided to find out if Hani had really had the courage to challenge her. In that case, he had to put the girl back in her place. So he grabbed her head with his hands. But suddenly the screams of the maids were heard, saying that there were imperial knights outside, leaving Eleonora in shock. The protagonist immediately understood that the boy had indeed told his father everything. Frightened, the woman began to think frantically, and ordered the room to be cleaned quickly. The little girl, already tied up, was put in a closet and taped over her mouth. One of the maids was ordered to keep an eye on the girl, so that she did not make a single noise. Turning to Hani, Eleonora ordered her to play dead, because they still had things to discuss. After that, he closed the closet door, leaving the little girl in the dark, and hurried towards the gentleman. Finally, upon arriving at the place, the knights, led by Captain Drake, saluted His Highness. Drake was especially glad to hear that the former Empress was fine. It turned out that Emperor Frederick had ordered to check on Her Highness, Princess Hani. Eleonora smiled wryly, not remembering when she and the Emperor became so close as to pay each other visits. However, the captain did not care, as he was only carrying out His Majesty's order. The woman pretended to understand his intentions, but now was not the time, because the princess was sleeping after the etiquette class. Drake was puzzled. Did the lady intend to disobey the emperor's order? Eleonora was outraged that they asked her to wake up the little princess just to present herself to them. The soldiers apologized, as it was an order from Her Majesty, but the woman did not let them finish. Eleonora began to scream angrily, asking if, now that she was no longer empress, her words were no longer worth anything. He refused to show the girl until the Emperor Frederick himself came in person. Annie was listening to everything from the closet and praying for some miracle, apologizing for the inconvenience. Drake and his men had no choice but to retreat. Hearing those words, a shiver ran down the bound girl's back, because if the knights just left now, the princess's life would not be better than before. Suddenly, the corridor was filled with the powerful voice of the emperor, who did not understand what all this fuss was. Expecting such behavior from the former empress, Frederick decided to come himself. Drake greeted his highness with a bow, apologizing for not being able to figure it out on his own. Eleonora did not understand why such a busy person had to visit them. If I just wanted to ask about the princess's health, I could have chosen another day, but the emperor refused. Why had he come to see his younger sister? And did I need any more reasons for that? The girl heard how she demanded to be shown to Princess Hanny immediately. Trying to make excuses, Eleonora was shocked by Frederick's insistence, who had not come even once in the last 9 years. That's why now he must have had a strong reason to insist on waking the sleeping girl. To the woman's horror, it turned out that the emperor had received a report that some maids were dragging the princess by force. Feigning surprise, Eleonora acted as if she did not understand His Majesty's words. The maids also pretended that it was the first time they had heard such a thing, and that they did not understand anything. But Frederick only burst out laughing, since he did not expect that all the female employees were involved in the conspiracy. At the same instant, he gave the order to search the palace and find His Highness, Princess Hanny. The woman, horrified, began to scream, not understanding how they could make such a fuss over a few simple rumors. However, the young crown prince Oswald considered that the words of the former empress were completely wrong, because they were not just rumors. He had witnessed the incident himself. Eleonora stood transfixed with astonishment and fear, while Frederick raged at his son, whom he had ordered to wait and not to intervene. But Oswald thought that, since he was the first to see everything, he should stay until the end. The woman glared furiously at the insolent noble who dared to open his mouth. The emperor gave Eleonora one last chance to confess everything before the knights found the little girl. However, the woman kept insistently pretending that she didn't know anything, which made Frederick even more enraged. The former empress was determined to keep silent until the end, no matter what happens. Moreover, making a helpless face, she did not understand why the emperor was doing that to her. Suddenly, Oswald ordered the gentleman to open the closet that was in the corner of the room, thinking that the girl could be there. Eleonora looked at him in horror, standing motionless, and feeling a shiver of fear. Hearing everything that was happening, Hanny looked hopefully towards the closed door, waiting for her rescuers. Suddenly, the darkness inside the closet was pierced by a thin ray of light filtering in from outside. When the door was completely opened, everyone present saw a terrible scene. A scared and bound little girl. Oswald held out his hand to her joyfully, greeting the girl, who no longer had anything to fear. The first thing he did was to free her from the ropes that were hurting her, and took her to her father. Annie couldn't believe her eyes as she finally came face to face with the emperor. However, she was now determined to stop hesitating and start acting. Falling on her knees before Frederick, the girl began to beg the emperor to protect her from her mother's attacks. Eleonora looked at her daughter in amazement, not understanding how she could do that to her own mother. That scene was enough for the emperor to understand everything and be filled with rage. The first thing he did was to order the immediate arrest of the culprit and the whole life to her maids. Without taking her eyes off Frederick, Hanny heard behind her the screams of the girls the gentlemen were approaching. Suddenly, Oswald approached the girl and took her hand tenderly, which made the protagonist very nervous. Having made sure that the culprits were tied up, the emperor turned to the children. He wanted them to accompany him, leaving everything else in the hands of the gentleman. Just as the girl breathed a sigh of relief, she suddenly heard her mother's desperate scream. Eleonora was trembling with madness. Not understanding if perhaps her punishment had not been enough, he immediately started insulting his daughter, but Drake covered his mouth with his hand. Frederick was glad to finally see the real face of this woman, who apparently was no longer afraid of anything, and since she had provoked him herself, the Emperor ordered the captain to question Eleonora severely. When he turned to the children, he understood that they were probably already in shock, and he wanted to take them away as soon as possible. After that, he extended his hand towards Hani, with the intention of stroking her head. Frightened, the girl threw her head back, covering it with her hands, and closing her eyes. Seeing this, Frederick repented of his carelessness, and he asked his little sister for forgiveness. He didn't want to hurt her, and to prove it, he covered Hani with his imperial cloak. Knowing everything that had happened, the Emperor wanted to carry the girl in his arms. Annie, still in shock, nodded uncertainly, and immediately found herself in His Highness' arms. After that, she called her son, who was smiling sweetly looking at the protagonist. The father admired his bravery, but now they would have to talk about the boy's reckless outings. Annie received help, but all that warmth coming from the Emperor was so unfamiliar to her. Until now, she had been withering alone in the frozen palace. And now, was this really happening? Her thoughts were interrupted by Oswald, who was worried if the girl was okay. Looking at her eyes full of worry, the protagonist felt for the first time that someone cared about her. Embarrassed, she hid in Frederick's vest, and awkwardly accepted that he was fine. She believed with all her heart that those kind looks would not be just a passing dream, and at that moment, what she wanted most was to enjoy that warmth a little more. Soon after, the Emperor, his sister and her son, arrived safely at the palace. The senior butler Charles, accompanied by the servants, greeted His Highness, the son of the Empire. At that instant, the man's gaze fell on the injured girl in the Emperor's arms. Observing her carefully, he immediately thought that they should call the imperial doctor. Nodding in agreement, Frederick also wanted to know where the empresses were. Upon learning that they were both in the hall, the Emperor ordered the princess to be taken there after all the care. For a while, she decided to entrust her to the personal maid of the palace, a young woman named Viola. Taking the princess gently, the maid greeted her and invited to accompany her. Seeing this, Oswald started begging his father to let him go with Honey. When Frederick accepted, he knew that it would be difficult to get used to the relationship between the two of them, because at first glance they looked like two children, but Honey in reality was Oswald's aunt. Oswald, as he watched them walk away, the Emperor warned Charles that for a while there would be unrest in the palace. I thought that Eleonora was hiding the girl out of overcare, but it turned out to be much worse. Later, upon arriving at the hall, Frederick was greeted by his mother Constance and his wife Melissa. Both empresses were very worried, as they could not find Oswald anywhere. However, instead of giving explanations, the Emperor wanted to discuss something with them. Meanwhile, Viola took the children to a room where a doctor would check on the princess later. Sitting on a chair, Hani looked at herself in the mirror and concluded that she was now about 9 years old. He remembered a broken music box that he would turn on secretly when everyone was sleeping. At such moments, the girl imagined growing up in a happy family, full of love and harmony, just like Oswald, whose parents took care of and protected him. Suddenly, Hani noticed the boy's gaze, which was fixed on his wounds. A little embarrassed, she apologized to him, leaving the crown prince speechless. Oswald wondered, had the protagonist done something wrong? The girl was sure that he had been surprised to see something that he should not. So, instead of accepting apologies, the boy demanded that his aunt thank him for saving her. Those were his mother's words, and he, being an obedient and good son, remembered them very well. The protagonist felt a little uncomfortable by those words, and looked at Oswald attentively. Blushing and covering herself, the mouth with her hand, she thanked the hero in an insecure but sincere way for having saved her. The boy's face suddenly changed, showing an expression of excited enthusiasm. Looking at him, Hattie thought that if the light turned into a person, it would surely look just like this. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door, and a female voice asked permission to enter. Oswald gave his consent, and Agnes, who was the imperial physician, entered the room. The protagonist could hardly believe that she was seeing one of the 3 best doctors in the Empire in person. In her past life, it was Agnes who saved the Empress, after Eleonora poisoned her. To the doctor's great regret, Her Highness had to leave the room. It was necessary for the procedure, and she hoped that the Crown Prince would understand it. Walking out the door next to Viola, Oswald asked Agnes not to hurt the protagonist. Sitting down in front of the girl, and putting on her gloves, the doctor began to check her hands. A normal child would have cried, and tried to let go because of the pain, but Henny only made a small grimace. Very surprised, Agnes thought that this was how the girl faced all difficulties. When they finished, the princess's hands were completely bandaged. Suddenly, the girl was curious to know if she should show the scars she had under her clothes, which left the doctor in shock. Annie understood that the doctor should inform Her Highness about her condition. Agnes was curious to know how the girl knew about her homework, but the little girl had only supposed it. However, she was very grateful to the Emperor, who took care of her and saved her from her mother. Annie decided that, for the sake of her future, she had to show all the scars that were left after living in the palace. Agnes was half in shock. The trembling hands of the princess. The girl began to unbutton the buttons of the dress with insecurity, barely being able to control the trembling. Unable to hold on any longer, the young woman took his hands, leaving the protagonist confused. But the doctor just wanted to help the young princess take off her clothes. After examining the scars on Her Highness' body, Agnes wrote in the report that the princess suffered abuse on a regular basis. After receiving the necessary help, the girl finally went out to where Oswald and Viola were waiting for her. The guy immediately wanted to know how all the procedures had gone, and if she was okay. What she was most worried about was whether the doctor had harmed the girl. Then Hanny calmed him down, because thanks to him it didn't hurt at all. For Oswald, that was the most important thing, and he proposed to go immediately to his father. Upon entering the room, the protagonist immediately felt the incredible weight of the atmosphere floating in the air. It was not surprising, since surely the Emperor had already told the Empresses everything. Sitting down on the sofa, the girl just wanted to know if everyone really believed her. First of all, Frederick confessed that they had already read Agnes' report on her condition. Therefore, the Emperor wanted to personally thank her for the courage that the little girl had shown. Since he was present, an investigation was not necessary, but there was evidence to take away Eleonora's title. Melissa decided to interrupt her husband's speech, thinking that they were there to listen to the princess. The Empress wanted the girl to tell them for herself everything that had happened to her. Taking courage, the protagonist told them all the sufferings caused by her mother, which took away her will to live, living every day under oppression. She couldn't take it anymore, and decided to escape, but she was caught. Frederick was enraged when he heard that, not understanding why the little girl did not immediately ask for help, but he immediately came to his senses, because really they should have found out everything themselves. The protagonist remembered how her mother called her a disgusting monster, whom no one wanted or would help, and even if Hanny told everything to the Emperor, it would be useless, since she was the daughter of his worst enemy. That's why the protagonist couldn't ask for help, which left Frederick completely baffled. Constance clutched her head, in shock at what she had just heard. The Emperor began to blame himself for not having suspected anything when Eleonora's maids lied to his face. Now, he hardly felt worthy to ask forgiveness for not having understood everything before. Oswald ran and hugged Henny tightly, saying her name through tears. He never considered her a monster. On the contrary, that's what he called those who hurt him. But now he firmly promised the princess that he would never feel pain again. Unable to contain herself, the girl burst into tears on her shoulder. Feeling protected, Melissa reached out and hugged them tightly, fully supporting her son's words. Looking at the girl, the Empress understood how incredibly difficult that it had been for her to face everything alone. Constance decided that it was time to stop being lenient with Eleonora for her daughter. Everyone agreed, and now it was necessary to choose the punishment that would be given to the woman. At that moment, the children fell asleep on the sofa, after so much excitement. After a while, Hanny opened her eyes, and found herself on a soft bed, in an unfamiliar room. At the same time, at the other end of the bed, Oswald was peacefully stretching out. Since he had also just woken up, the princess asked him, and discovered that they were in her father's chambers. Suddenly, Hanny noticed that the boy's eyes were very swollen. Oswald only smiled, because the little girl's eyes were not much better. There was a brief pause in the air, and then, The protagonists let out a sincere laugh. The girl felt as if she had just woken up after a long winter. Outside, new shoots were blooming, symbolizing the arrival of the long-awaited spring. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, a guard was trying to silence the maids accused of helping Eleonora. They believed themselves innocent, thinking that they were only following their mistress's orders. One of them, crying, was ready to tell in detail everything that had happened. Next to the guard was Frederick, who was looking with displeasure towards the distant cell. There was Her Highness, the former Empress Eleonora, sitting quietly with her head down. All the maids were talking about her cruelty, so the Emperor wanted to hear the woman's own version, but she didn't say anything. She just looked at Frederick from time to time with the eyes of a maniac. The news about Eleonora's abuses spread like wildfire throughout the palace and beyond. Frederick knew that, being the former empress, she would still be the center of everyone's attention. However, it would take a compelling reason to take away the title and punish her accordingly. But what the Emperor was most worried about was how Honey would react to all this. That's why he invited the girl to his office, and she came accompanied by Oswald. Looking intently at the girl, Frederick wanted to tell her something important. Crossing his hands, the Emperor confessed that he planned to sentence Eleonora to the death penalty. The girl was surprised to hear the same sentence that was given to her mother in the past life. On that occasion, the woman unsuccessfully tried to poison the Emperor's mother, Constantia. When that happened, Eleonora and her daughter were locked up in a separate palace, where they lived all that time. However, later the woman tried to poison Melissa too, and this time she succeeded. So she was sentenced to death, and her daughter Henny was locked in a frozen palace on the snowy mountain, where she spent the rest of her life. Now, Eleonora's punishment was just as severe as before, but this time because of the girl. Seeing her look, Frederick hastened to clarify that the little girl was not to blame in all this. Besides, her mother had already tried to poison Constantia, so it was time for her to pay for her actions. The protagonist understood that the Emperor was worried about her, fearing that he would blame himself for her mother's death. But Hanny had prepared for this since she arrived here, and she didn't feel any guilt. Therefore, looking confidently at His Highness, he confessed to her that he was perfectly well. Frederick was surprised by such an unpleasant answer, determined and such an uncommon look in a girl. Then, he also confessed that the woman had lost her status, and that the execution would be in 2 days. At that moment, the little girl was curious to know if her mother recognized that he had treated her badly. It turned out that Eleonora denied everything, and considered herself completely innocent. They also unmasked the maids who were accusing each other, to try to save themselves. They too would receive a severe punishment. And upon hearing this, Hanny decided to obey His Majesty's orders. Bowing down, he thanked the Emperor endlessly for having them saved. Then Frederick ordered him to raise his head, for he had only done what he should have done long ago. It surprised her that although she and Oswald were the same age, the girl seemed much more mature. Thinking about it, she remembered that her son still calls the protagonist by her first name, although they were the same age. Hanny was Frederick's sister, so Oswald should call her aunt. However, the boy did not agree. He wanted them to call each other by his first name. The father did not object, but wanted the child to ask permission from the princess herself. Looking at her with bright eyes, he hoped that Her Highness would not refuse him permission. It turns out that almost no one called him by name. Everyone called him the Crown Prince. Only a few could call him by his first name, and Hanny was one of them. That's why Oswald expected me to accept. Squinting her eyes at the light radiating from the child, the protagonist decided that she could afford everything. Hearing his consent, and seeing his son's happy face, Frederick burst out laughing. Unable to contain his emotions, Oswald threw himself on the girl, and wrapped her in a warm hug. 2 days later, the day of the execution finally came, and at that time, the children were in the room reading books. According to Charles, His Highness ordered to prohibit the protagonists from leaving the palace until everything was over. Of course, a responsible adult would not let children see such an appalling thing. So, although it made her sad, the protagonist understood that it was the right thing to do. But suddenly, Oswald slammed the book shut, and proposed to Hanny to follow him. The desire to see the execution of that woman could be seen on his face, and although they could not get close to the place of execution, the little crown prince knew a shortcut. Extending his hand to the girl, the protagonist hoped that she could trust him. Deciding to think about the consequences later, Hanny accepted and shook his hand in response, opening the door carefully. The children crept out and headed towards the exit without being seen. Suddenly, a man's voice was heard behind them. Surprised to see them there, it was the captain of the knights, Drake, who was also the emperor's right-hand man. However, it turned out that Oswald knew perfectly well that the captain would be there without fail, and now the boy wanted Drake to personally take them to the palace gates. Of course, the captain refused, but it was not a request with nothing in return, because the crown prince knew that, half a year ago, Drake broke his father's favorite vase, but everyone thought it had been Melissa, and when he heard this, the captain was horrified. The guy found out about this in a conversation between him and the empress. When he happened to pass by, Oswald's mother had made that vase with her own hands, as a gift for his father, and something like that would not be forgiven even to his right hand. And Drake even tried to hide behind the empress, which left the captain even more puzzled. After that, the captain of the knights looked at the children with a pleading look. The girl also made such a face, wishing to watch the execution from afar, and in silence. The young captain was surprised at how desperately the young princess begged. A little later, the palace maids, who were in the courtyard, heard footsteps behind them, and turned around. They were surprised to see Drake carrying the children in his arms, knowing that they were forbidden to leave the palace. Oswald thanked her, promising in return to keep her secret no matter what. Around the same time, the second squad of knights was escorting the criminals to the scaffold. Suddenly, the heroes heard the voice of the emperor, who did not understand what they were doing there. I remembered perfectly well having given the order not to let the children out, so I was waiting for an explanation from the captain. Drake, paralyzed, started sweating, and tried to say something uncertainly. At the same moment, the second division began to salute the impressed son, Her Majesty Frederica. Eleonora was surprised to hear that the emperor was nearby, and looked towards him. Suddenly, she saw her daughter, who was calm and watching the woman. Frightened, Frederick quickly covered the little girl, leaving her confused. At that instant, insults and curses directed at the girl came out of Eleonora's mouth. The woman did not believe that the imperial family could love her after she betrayed her own mother. Now Eleonora was sure that she should have got rid of that ungrateful monster from the very beginning. When she heard the threats and insults, the protagonist realized that those words no longer scared her. Seeing his mother broken and unhappy, Hanny could not believe that she had suffered so much because of him. It was precisely this reaction of the woman that was the reason why the emperor did not want them to meet. He immediately ordered the soldiers who counted the march to the scaffold, and took that wretch from his sight. However, Eleonora suddenly dropped to the ground, leaving the knights in shock. He bit the hand of one of the soldiers, and demanded to be released immediately. The other gentleman dragged her away by force. Listening to her endless insults towards Hanny, the woman cursed her daughter, thinking that one day they would also get rid of her like garbage. And she was glad that Hanny was going to witness the execution, because according to Eleonora, the same fate awaited the girl. At that moment, Drake covered his mouth with a rag, leaving everyone surprised. I didn't understand how soldiers could forget how to shut up criminals out of their minds. Holding Honey's hand, Oswald wanted her not to take his mother's words seriously. The girl looked at the crown prince in surprise, confused and not knowing what to say, but gathering courage, she firmly declared that this woman's words would no longer affect her. Eleonora looked surprised at the girl, who said goodbye to her in a calm voice. Annie stayed there until her mother walked through the front door and disappeared from her sight. As her mother's figure grew smaller with each step, the protagonist's emotions also faded. Frederick thought that the Second Templar should return to training, and Drake offered to tell him. However, according to the Emperor, the captain was no exception either, and he accepted it with resignation. Annie was worried about him, but Oswald remained calm, knowing his father's leniency towards Drake. Then the Emperor reminded them that this was no time to worry about others. He also wanted to hear the excuses of the children who had disobeyed the order. Hearing that they had to get ready, Hanny immediately closed her eyes, thinking that she was going to be beaten. But Frederick came up, gently ruffled her hair, and then turned away. After sending the children with Drake to the palace, the Emperor went to the gate. On his way to the execution, Annie watched him walk away for a while, rubbing the part of her head that he had caressed. Upon returning to the palace, the children began to devour sweets, and Oswald offered the protagonist a cookie. Annie still couldn't believe that all this was really happening to her. Even to think that he had come back from the dead, and that everything was going so well, seemed strange to him. Lost in thought, she did not notice when Oswald took her hand carefully. Coming out of her trance, Annie looked at the crown prince, hoping that it would all be worth it. Seeing the distant look of the protagonist, the guy decided to find out what was bothering her. It turned out that I was just not at all sure that all that was not a dream. That's why Annie didn't want to bother Oswald, thinking he just had to get used to it. Then, with a determined look, the crown prince thought that the girl should remember something important, and that was that they were a family, and Oswald loved the protagonist very much. Annie was surprised that the guy called her family, but he was very sure of his words, so she had nothing to worry about, because all her fears would never come true. Not being sure if she deserved that treatment, the little girl decided to ask if he really considered her part of his family. That question made Oswald laugh, because for him they had always been family, since they were born. However, seeing her reaction, the protagonist thought that maybe that made Honey sad, but it was the opposite, and the protagonist felt really happy about what he said. Suddenly, Charles came through the door, greeting the children, and hoping that they had had a good rest. The butler was hoping he could borrow Sir Drake for a moment, because he wanted to talk to him about something. Hearing whispers behind the door, the children thought that they would probably talk about the execution. After a while, Drake finally came back with them, with a very confused expression on his face. It turned out that the execution ceremony was over, and Her Majesty would soon return to the palace. By his face, the protagonist understood that the captain was hiding something, but decided not to ask. However, she decided to apologize to Sir Drake for the inconvenience. Smiling and getting down on his knees, the captain sincerely asked him to always call him by his name. Besides, there was no need to apologize, because the deal had been fair, and now they had to keep their secret. Smiling from ear to ear, the girl promised that she would not even hint at anything about her secret. When the Emperor returns, the captain will go to load sandbags at the training camp. As for the children, they would have to face Frederick's wrath, but Oswald decided to protect Honey. However, the protagonist did not want that, thinking that she should take responsibility together with others. Then, seeing her determination, the crown prince decided to propose something to the girl that could help. Drake watched in amazement as the two children whispered about something very seriously. The protagonist was shocked by what she heard, but Oswald believed that only she could achieve it, and if they did everything as he said, the father would not be able to scold and punish them so severely. However, Annie didn't see much point in that, biting her lip nervously. Just at that moment, a maid arrived, who invited the children to an audience with the king. The protagonists were transfixed by how fast events were unfolding. The Emperor was waiting for them in his office, looking at those who entered with an intimidating expression. I hoped that Oswald and Henny would at least try to apologize for disobeying the order. The atmosphere was so tense that, swallowing saliva, the girl took a step forward. The first thing he did was confess that he just wanted to see his mother for the last time with his own eyes. Annie thought that only then could she truly realize that she had finally freed herself from cruelty and abuse. Now the moment Oswald was talking about had come, and the crown prince made a sign to him to act. Clasping her hands together and opening her eyes wide, the girl thought, "Is the Emperor going to punish her?" The atmosphere was so charged with tension that the protagonist could not even move. From Frederick's stern expression, it could be seen that the plan had failed miserably. But suddenly, the Emperor decided not to scold the children, which filled them with joy. Instead, he decided to punish the girl, starting to extend his hand towards her. Seeing that, and hearing her words, Annie was horrified, and became paralyzed again. Shrunken and with her eyes closed, the protagonist was trembling with fear, waiting for a cruel punishment. The Emperor ruffled her hair again, putting his hand on her head, and leaving her confused. The punishment was that now Frederick would pat his head without warning. The Emperor also hoped that the little girl would soon get used to it. Since it was already getting dark outside, she decided to let the kids go, which made Oswald, Honey and Drake excited at the same time. However, Frederick was only referring to the children, because the captain had to stay a little longer. After all, they didn't have to talk about something. For example, when Drake became so daring, the captain would pretend that everything was fine and act like that in front of Honey, but in reality it wasn't like that. He held the position of commander of the knights, so he looked older and tired. That's why at that moment, the last thing she wanted was to go to the training camp, so she decided to use Honey's method, putting on a tender face. But for some reason it didn't work. That made the emperor angry, because Drake was already an adult and should have a conscience. So Frederick ordered him to take the sandbags and go back to the training ground. The news of Eleonora's death threw the whole palace into chaos, and Honey was glad to find out so soon. It was not surprising that Sir Drake returned that day with a strange expression, since the people killed her before the execution, aping her. Her end was not much different from that of her previous life, when the people rebelled against her for trying to poison Constance. She was a generous empress who took care of her people even after the death of her husband. Now, the situation was completely different from that of the past life, as Honey revealed the abuse before the attack on Melissa. Society really had compassion for her. The little girl knew that everything would end the moment everyone discovered their ice powers. As long as the fear of magic was still in people's minds, I couldn't get out of this unscathed. However, her new room was full of new things, which showed the sincere care of the imperial family towards her. The protagonist was intrigued if she had already gotten used to having a family with these people who were always by his side. He had hopes again, even if they were in vain. That's why he felt guilty about hiding his abilities from everyone. Although Frederick gave him a music box and secretly kept the ice castle where he lived, Annie decided to tell him the truth, hoping in return to receive help or face the consequences. But that no longer mattered, and the girl was ready to accept any result. The next morning, he had a leisurely breakfast with Oswald in the imperial dining room. Annie thought that in the end, as an emperor, Frederick might even be served by his powers, but the protagonist had no idea how to prove that he could be useful. Seeing the girl's serious face, Oswald was curious to know what was wrong with her. She smiled at him, surprised by the boy's ability to notice every detail. After breakfast, the crown prince left for classes, promising to see the princess later. When waving goodbye, the protagonist decided that it was not time to waste time. While Oswald was studying, she also had to find her own way of learning. Suddenly, he heard the voice of the servants talking about the arrival of spring. That meant they wouldn't be able to enjoy the ice chips for a while. With their salaries, they couldn't even dream of that in the warm season, unless the imperial family invited them. Viola, who was accompanying the little girl, was surprised to see that she suddenly stopped in her tracks. But the girl finally saw the opportunity she had been looking for all this time. That same day he left the maids very confused with his unexpected decision. The girls immediately thought that maybe they had done something wrong with her. One of the maids tried to explain to her that, if the lady had any inconvenience, she could always come to them. However, the girl insisted that she wanted to take a bath alone. In the end, the protagonist managed to convince the servants that she was no longer so small, and so she got what she wanted. The maids decided to wait for the princess outside, in case she needed anything. Finally, alone, Henny stood in the middle of the bathroom and got ready, concentrating. He began to move his arms, releasing icy energy. By casting the spell, he created an ice crystal in the air, from which an intense cold was coming out. The girl realized that her abilities were still at the same level as in her past life, and this time, it would be better to show off their powers immediately and prove that they were useful. However, because of his young age, he couldn't handle magic as delicately as before. The protagonist would have to visit Her Majesty after recovering her abilities. Still, he was glad to remember the feeling of using his powers. After that, she took a bath and went out quietly with the maids who were waiting for her by the door. While they were drying the princess with towels, the girls thought it was adorable that she wanted to take a bath by herself. But even after 10 days, her decision was still the same, leaving the girls baffled. During all that time, Henny went to bathe by herself every time. The maids thought that probably the girls simply did not want to show anyone the wounds on her body. They were sure that His Highness needed time to recover from his terrible past. That's why every time, they waited patiently behind the door, while the little girl practiced ice magic. By the 10th day, he was already controlling the ice with ease, completely mastering it. Now everything was ready, and it only remained to warn the emperor. In her mind, she was hoping Frederick would put his hand on her head again and tussle her hair a little. But Hani also knew that if something went wrong, she would have to use her powers to escape, because the princess had already firmly decided that she would never return to the snowy mountains. After a while, he finally arrived at the emperor's palace, guarded by Drake and his team. The captain was very surprised to see the girl walking alone and so calmly smiling at her. She immediately understood that the princess had come to visit her highness. However, it turned out that he also had something very important to communicate to the emperor. Suddenly, Hani noticed the look of one of the gentlemen guarding the entrance. When trying to smile at her, the gentleman made such a strange grimace that it left her completely bewildered. Shocked by what she saw, Hani thought that his highness was surely busy and would not be able to receive her. But Drake was sure that he did not have so much unfinished business, so he ordered Scott to warn Frederick of the arrival of the princess. Scott turned out to be the same gentleman who smiled at the girl and did not understand what had scared her so much. Finally, arriving in front of the door of the emperor's office, the protagonist hesitated a little and then knocked awkwardly. Upon receiving permission to enter, she opened the door resolutely and saw Frederick sitting among piles of papers. Remembering Drake's words and seeing the huge pile of documents on Frederick's desk, the girl thought about coming back another time. However, the emperor thought that she had nothing to worry about, because he could finish that job very quickly, and no matter how busy he was, Frederick couldn't just refuse his younger sister when she came to see him. First of all, he invited her to sit at the table, where there were several sweets and a teapot with tea. The emperor was eager to hear what his little sister wanted to tell him, but suddenly the girl got up from the table and fell to her knees, making a deep bow to Frederick. His request was that his highness would allow him to stay at the imperial palace. Surprised by her request, Frederick thought that in that case she didn't have to ask for it. It was completely natural that he could stay there, since the emperor was the girl's older brother. But Hani understood that until that moment she had not told his highness an important thing, and when he heard it, maybe he would change his mind about her. Gathering courage, the princess confessed that she had the power to freeze with ice. For a moment, the emperor stood motionless, silently looking at the girl. Annie didn't know if it was time to start running away, or if she should wait a little longer. Now, Frederick understood why his words had not reassured the protagonist. She was curious to know if Eleonora knew her ability, to which she received a negative response, because at that time only 2 people knew about Honey's power, and both of them were there. The protagonist knew she could hide it forever, but he did not want to repay the favor the emperor had done him in this way. Frederick was completely calm, and also willing to help his sister. The girl looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he accepted so easily. For his part, Frederick also did not understand why the protagonist had an expression full of distrust. He knew that for someone with a power that terrified the entire empire, it was dangerous to stay in the imperial palace. However, Frederick had already realized that Hani was not one of those children who abuse their abilities, because if the girl had wanted to, that would have happened a long time ago, and the first to suffer would have been Eleonora, and then surely the maids. But it was Hani who appeared full of scars from the constant beatings. The emperor understood that he could never forget that incident. Therefore, trusting the girl, she hoped that her decision would not be a mistake. After that, he sat down next to the princess with a smile and held out his hand to her. Although the girl had prepared for the worst, she was very glad that the emperor believed her, remembering that in these cases he should give thanks. Hani thanked his highness wholeheartedly. Frederick was also grateful to the little girl for her incredible bravery. Then, he ruffled her hair, which made her very happy. The emperor discovered that the girl already had full control over her powers. She understood that it was best to show it, but she had to choose a place where it didn't matter if there were traces of water left. Then Frederick proposed to go to the bathroom, which was right next to that office. Annie was surprised, not imagining how busy he must be to have a private bathroom in his office. When she arrived, the girl stepped aside and got ready to start. He took a deep breath, concentrated the magic in his hands, and created ice crystals. Then, he made the blocks rise, while Frederick quietly watched what was happening. In front of her eyes, Hani began to shape the ice, from geometric figures to Oswald's head. Sure, The emperor had already heard from her about her good control of the skill, but the result exceeded all expectations. At the same time, he understood that there are no eternal secrets in this world. That's why Frederick wanted to propose using those skills for good. And Hani even had an idea about it. He thought they could create ice and then sell it, using the proceeds to help those in need. The emperor knew that the main problem of the ice business was the lack of means to preserve it. But if Hani used her magic well, the ice would practically not be damaged. The supply would become constant. People's lives would improve. And then, even if they discovered the girl's magic, no one would judge her. When she received the approval for her idea, the protagonist was very excited. Upon learning that the money left over after helping people, she was planning to give it to the emperor. Frederick was speechless, unable to contain himself. He burst out laughing, thinking that his little sister had no reason to try to pay him, at least because she was still at that age when it is natural to simply receive. The emperor decided that the remaining money would be left to her, but I was hoping that the girl would donate something to charity. She believed that the good deeds Hani did would one day become the force that would protect her. At that moment, the girl decided to say goodbye, saying goodbye to Her Highness. Suddenly, a shiny bracelet fell from the little girl's dress, leaving Frederick in shock. When she realized that he had noticed and was lifting the bracelet, the protagonist got very scared. The bracelet was quite simple, and the emperor did not understand why he was wearing it in his pocket and not on his wrist. Suddenly, he realized that it was his money, saved in case he had to escape, and he had to confess that she planned to run away if something went wrong, and the bracelet was to be sold in that case. The girl did not dare to look at His Highness, who suddenly began to laugh at him hysterically. Frederica had a fit of laughter when she saw that, among all the jewels in her room, Hani chose that simple bracelet. Noticing that the protagonist turned as red as a tomato, he laughed even louder. When he managed to calm down, he understood the girl and promised her that he would stop disturbing her. Now she could go back to her room in peace, especially since Oswald had probably already lost sight of her. Making a farewell bow, Hani thanked His Highness from the bottom of his heart for his kindness. As he watched the little girl walk out the door, Frederick remembered a person. Just as the emperor thought, that man was perfect for that job. When she went out on the street, the protagonist was very glad that everything had ended so well. Suddenly, Scott called her. He approached the princess and bowed to her. When he introduced himself, he said his name and that he was a member of the Order of Knights. Annie recognized him immediately by his unforgettable smile, which gave her goosebumps. Scott thought that the previous time his behavior might have been quite offensive. It seemed to him that the girl looked worried, so he tried to help her, but it seems that he went a little too far. So now, Scott was apologizing to Her Majesty for his attitude. Falling on his face to the ground, he was ready to accept any punishment that the princess considered just. Annie tried to reassure him, understanding that the gentleman only acted like this out of concern for her, but Scott refused to accept such kindness, for such had been the relations between a master and his gentleman. At least that's what the captain always taught him. And just then Drake arrived, ordering Scott to keep quiet. The captain apologized to the protagonist for her behavior. Then, Hani rushed to explain that the noble knight only came over because he was worried. In that case, Drake was glad to introduce the knight who, despite his youth, had become the second strongest in the order. Smiling, Honey and Scott promised to take care of each other. The gentleman found it a little uncomfortable that the captain praised his skills so much. He decided to try even harder and become a good warrior for His Majesty. Seeing them, the girl dreamed that everyone would treat her with the same kindness. Frederick had a half-brother, Christopher, who completely rejected the title of Archduke and ended up being Duke. There was no one better to produce ice, since he owned the Hern Mountains. After a while, the emperor invited the little girl to introduce him to Christopher. The previous time, Honey didn't try the cupcakes, but this time she couldn't resist, and they turned out to be delicious. The Duke really was perfect for that business, but the problem was whether he accepted. Of all the members of the imperial family, he was the one who hated Eleonora the most, and therefore also his daughter. Suddenly, the door slammed open and Christopher appeared on the threshold. However, the scruffy appearance of the Duke greatly puzzled the protagonist. In Hanny's memories, he was a man always impeccable, elegant, with glasses and a very formal tuxedo, because he wasn't wearing glasses. He didn't even see the little girl, and walked past her, with a resigned sigh, dropping down on the sofa next to his brother. Christopher was glad to finally be able to rest. Frederick considered it a brave act, but his brother had already traveled for 4 days without stopping, by order of the emperor. The Duke was puzzled, not understanding why such urgency. It turned out that a good investment opportunity had arisen, and Frederick wanted his brother to get back into the business. Seeing Christopher's stunned look, the emperor clarified that it was the ice business. The Duke was surprised to think that new technologies for preserving ice had emerged during his absence. However, although Frederick guaranteed success, Christopher did not understand why such a hurry. Then Hattie couldn't take it anymore and explained that with the new method, the emperor was referring to his abilities. Hearing an unknown voice, the Duke became alert and began to take out his glasses. When he looked through the lens, he saw Eleanor's daughter Henny sitting in front of him, filled with rage. He didn't understand what skills they were talking about, or why that girl was there. Frederick introduced her as his brother's future partner, hoping that the girl would show her skills. Since Henny's power to create ice was quite dangerous, the emperor wanted to give her a slightly different role. Hearing about some power again, Christopher was completely confused. Frederick wanted his little sister to maintain the temperature and integrity of the ice for a long time. Upon receiving the order to act, the princess began to concentrate magic in her hand. Then, before the Duke's eyes, who was in shock, she created several ice spears in the air. He gathered them into a saucer and immediately offered them to the emperor. It was cold condensed air, which could help the production machine to keep the ice frozen for longer. Christopher was stunned when he saw that, realizing that it really was the power of ice. And he couldn't help but admit that, with that skill, the ice business was destined for success. However, the Duke wanted nothing to do with that woman's daughter, so the emperor decided to tell her the latest news. The girl did not want Frederick to insist so much if the Duke really did not want, but the emperor decided to try anyway, knowing that soon the fun would begin. First of all, he explained to his brother that this woman had already been dead for a long time. After that, she told Christopher in full detail everything that had happened and about Hanny. Hearing the story, Christopher hit the table with his fist so hard that all the cups and plates with cakes fell to the floor. Crying with rage and indignation, I didn't understand how much longer this was going to keep happening. The protagonist had heard that the Duke was a cold person, who did not even blink if someone died in front of him, but seeing him crying inconsolably, the girl understood once again that one cannot believe rumors. Although he had a rather stern appearance, according to the emperor, Frederick was full of compassion. When he had finished crying, Christopher took the contract from his brother's outstretched hand. When she saw the cups and saucers scattered on the floor, the protagonist was glad that nothing had been broken. Only then did he understand the reason for the emperor's reaction to the bracelet, which was surely cheaper than that crockery. After carefully reviewing all the points, Christopher came to the conclusion that everything seemed fine to him. So, Frederick asked him to vacate one of the palaces in a couple of days, which surprised the Duke. However, the emperor planned to give it to Princess Honey, since she didn't have her own palace yet. The girl thought that this was not necessary, because she could live in the old palace, but Christopher insisted, since in addition, according to the contract, he would have to visit the protagonist every time. Then the girl agreed, which made the Duke a little uncomfortable. Since the problem was already solved, the emperor was now planning to get rid of the things from the girl's old palace. Annie agreed, wanting to be left with only one thing out of everything that was there. When he received the permit, he immediately ran out to go get that at the palace. As punishment for his daring behavior, Frederick sent his brother after the girl to help him carry the things. Christopher accepted and went out. Seeing the protagonist by the fountain, the girl walked down the road towards the entrance, and the Duke followed her. During the whole journey, not a single word was said to each other, and the girl did not even notice his presence. Arriving at the palace where she used to live with her mother, Henny stopped for a moment. Christopher was watching with interest the surroundings of the castle, where he had not been for about 10 years. Upon entering, the protagonist went straight to the door that led to her old room. There was a real chaos inside, with broken objects everywhere. Seeing the mess in the room, Christopher wondered if it was possible to find something there, but suddenly, the girl began to pick up a box of life from the floor of broken music, leaving the Duke in shock. Earlier, he had been very indignant about Frederick's decision to give that object to that woman's daughter, but the Emperor simply wanted to make a gift to his sister, who was the same age as Oswald, and now the protagonist carefully picked up the remains of the box from the floor. Looking at them sadly, unable to contain his emotions anymore, Christopher burst into tears again, revealing his presence to Hanny. She was very surprised that the Duke had also decided to come here. The protagonist confessed that he came at the request of his brother, and that he was intrigued by the valuable object of the princess. Seeing that the box was broken, he thought that it was dangerous for a little girl, but the girl firmly decided not to throw it away. Although the Duke intended to keep the box, surprised by this request, the protagonist slowly approached and reluctantly handed the box to her. The way back to the palace passed in the same silence. Suddenly, Christopher stopped and addressed the young princess, leaving her bewildered. The Duke confessed that all that time, he had sincerely hated the little girl, because she was Eleonora's daughter. I couldn't think of anything good, really knowing her. It was that woman's nature. But then he understood everything that the girl had been through. Christopher only believed in what he saw, and in the end, he ended up hating innocent people. And the protagonist knew that it was too late for that, but he still dared. Bowing down, he apologized for having judged Hania. Until that moment, he was really sorry for all the pain he caused her with his attitude. Of course, he could not bring himself to ask her to accept his apology at once, but Christopher wanted to prove his sincerity with facts and earn the right to be forgiven. Seeing her honesty, the protagonist also decided not to stay silent and say everything. She knew the reasons for her hatred and thought that, although it hurt, she couldn't do anything about it. It was very unfair, because no one chooses where to be born. Still, Henny was sincerely grateful that the protagonist was the first to apologize. She believed in his sincerity, so she accepted the apology with joy, leaving Christopher surprised. But the princess did not hesitate, because he himself had promised to prove it by actions. Therefore, the protagonist hoped that the Duke would simply keep his word. At the sight of her innocent smile, Christopher began to smack his face, feeling like a real useless. Annie tried to stop him, as he had a cut on his hand from a broken box, and had to hurry. Agreeing with her, the Duke put his arm around the girl's waist. He picked her up and started walking back calmly. Confused, the protagonist became even more convinced that she should not believe the rumors. Meanwhile, an atmosphere of hustle and bustle and everyday life reigned in Christopher's palace. Soon after, the Duke entered through the front door, still holding the little girl in his arms. Upon seeing him, one of the servants, named Mabrilio, was surprised that the lord had returned so soon from the emperor. The maids were also delighted at the arrival of the owner, and were curious to know how the meeting with his highness had gone. Suddenly, they saw a little girl that Christopher was carrying under his arm. The girls and the servant were shocked to see that he was carrying the princess, as if she were an object. They understood that surely the poor girl was uncomfortable. And besides, she probably dared not say anything before the gloomy lord. But Christopher thought that everything would be fine, since he had carried Oswald like that before, and he never complained. Realizing that Hattie could really hurt, she apologized to the girl for the inconvenience. The maids also began to apologize to the little girl, thinking that it must be difficult to bear the Duke's rudeness. But the princess began to defend the hero, thanks to whom she had come so quickly there. Taking a candy out of her pocket, one of the maids offered it to her with a smile, wanting to invite the girl. It was a handmade candy from a famous pastry shop, with an extraordinary taste. At that moment, the protagonist felt a strange restlessness inside, not understanding what the reason was. After the girl gratefully accepted the candy, the maid introduced herself as Gerda. Suddenly, Gerda and the others saw a cut on Henny's arm, and were horrified, noticing the looks of bewilderment. The Duke explained that the protagonist had cut herself with a broken box. The servants were very glad that their fears about the lord were not confirmed. Christopher ordered that they should go at once to fetch the palace doctor. While they were waiting for the doctor, the hero decided to take the young princess to the living room. Gerda and Mabrilio were ordered to follow them, while the other servants could attend to their duties. The employees were surprised, wondering if the gentleman had not thrown them out too abruptly. With a wave of the hand, The Duke ordered snacks to be brought for him and the girl to the living room. Following Christopher, Honey in a moment turned and waved to the girls who were staying. The maids were moved by such tenderness, without hiding their feelings. It surprised them that, although she looked like Eleonora, the atmosphere around the girl was completely different, and since the Lord had brought her personally, they wanted to do their best for the little one. A few minutes later, the royal doctor arrived in the living room where the protagonists were. Annie was hoping to see Agnes, but instead, a serious man came in with a briefcase. His name was August, and his presence made the protagonist nervous. After examining her, he concluded that the princess just needed to lower her fever a little. August was outraged, not understanding why such a talented doctor as he should waste his time at that moment, that place. He had treated the emperor personally, and now he had to take care of a poor princess, without power or contacts. While she was saying all this aloud, suddenly her gaze fell on the Duke, whom she instantly recognized. Then the doctor immediately changed his attitude, starting to flatter the hero. August thought that it was not worth wasting time with a useless girl, and that it was better to check on the Duke first. She immediately noticed a small cut on Christopher's cheek, and wanted to take care of him without delay. As for the little one, according to the doctor, her injuries could wait a little while. Shocked by what he heard, the servants concluded that they had just lost a staff doctor. They just hoped that the Lord wouldn't get too angry, because it might scare Honey. Christopher gave an order, and 2 servants headed towards August, who was paralyzed. They rushed up, and in an instant, reduced the frightened doctor on the floor. Augustus did not understand why the Duke suddenly decided to act like this with him. Christopher was surprised that, for someone who ignored the princess, this was a surprise. The doctor tried to justify himself, since the hero himself had also considered the girl a nuisance recently. However, even if the Duke hated her, does that take away from her the royal title of princess? And how dare the doctor look over his shoulder at a member of the royal family? But Christopher did not deny that in the past, he really hated Honey, and now, as Augustus himself can see, everything has really changed, radically. That means that the hero will no longer allow a nobody to ignore and belittle the princess. He intended to personally inform the emperor about this situation. While Augustus was waiting for his punishment, the servants dragged the man down the corridor, from where his desperate screams could still be heard. Waiting for a while, Gerda thought that if she had known earlier, she would have simply asked for medicines to be brought to her. Annie was completely calm, as she had long since gotten used to this. Christopher was horrified by her words, and looked at the girl in bewilderment, sitting opposite. She didn't want to hear him say things like that anymore. The Duke would always be ready to help her. That's why he hoped that if something happened, Honey would come to him immediately. As she began to heal her wounds, the hero suddenly noticed how thin the little girl was. It turned out that she was now even plumper than before, which left Christopher confused. When the treatment was over, Mavrelia was curious to know where the scar on the gentleman's cheek had come from. To the servant's surprise, the Duke had made the wound himself, striking his face. He did it as punishment for being so rude to Honey. Then Mavrelia and Gerda remembered that the Lord had already done many things before that deserved punishment, and now they were glad that he had matured and began to think more rationally. Sighing, Christopher was curious to know how his attitude would change if suddenly the owner changed. Upon hearing about the change of ownership, Mavrelia was shocked and opened his mouth in surprise. Then, the protagonist was happy to introduce them to the new owner, pointing to Honey, something that had already been confirmed by the emperor. He hoped that the servants would take care of her as carefully as they took care of him. Gerda and Mavrelia jumped for joy, because now the palace would be much more fun. When the day of the protagonist's move came, the servants in her old room were actively collecting things and cleaning. According to Viola, August was discovered in corruption and sent to prison on the outskirts. He also dressed the princess, putting on her a spectacular dress with sparkles. While Honey was worrying about how she would greet the new servants today, Oswald was at her side with an angry face. He thought that the girl did not have to go to another palace and leave him here alone. Annie thanked him for his words, but there was nothing more to be done. Besides, the luggage was almost ready. Then, the guy made her promise that they would visit each other every day. It was time to leave, and Christopher came in to call the little one. Annie nodded, and Oswald expressed a great desire to go with them. However, the Duke knew that the boy had classes today, but he was just quietly smiling. The protagonist did not have the strength to resist, especially because if he simply forbade it, Honey would start comforting Oswald. As they approached the new palace of the protagonist, Christopher's face was filled with amazement, smiling and putting his hands to his head. He thought that someone clearly does not know how to control himself. Walking a little further, he covered the eyes of the little girl with his hand, who suddenly noticed the aroma of something sweet. As he approached the entrance, the Duke wanted Hanny to look very carefully ahead. Removing her hand, she let the girl see a crowd of servants who had arranged a party in honor of her arrival. The protagonist was shocked by the colorful decorations and the endless compliments she received. As we passed through the corridor formed by the staff, cheerful greetings were heard everywhere. Seeing Hanny's surprised face, Gerda thought that it was still too early for the lady to be amazed. With those words, even the always serious Duke felt quite uncomfortable. At that moment, the chef of the palace appeared, who was bringing in a cart of 3-story cake made by himself. Oswald was deeply impressed by the elegance and beauty of that masterpiece of baking. Unlike him, Hanny was looking at the huge cake with eyes full of fear and amazement. Before, the protagonist had never had something like this, and she thought she didn't need it either. And now, his heart was beating in a completely different way than it did before. Smiling, Oswald thought that today Hanny was the main protagonist, so he should just enjoy. When she reached out her hand to him, the girl realized that now she really was not alone. She considered not only the cake beautiful, but everything that had been prepared for her that day. Crying with happiness, Hanny thought it was as if today was her birthday. Hearing this, Mabril was also moved to tears, and Carta thought that for them it was also the best day. When she heard the proposal to blow out the candles, the little girl got nervous, since it was the first time she had done it. At that moment, Christopher realized that no one had ever thrown him a party before. Therefore, the Duke decided to prepare well for the banquet in honor of his birthday. First of all, the protagonist shared the chef's special cake with everyone present. Seeing the atmosphere of this place, and tasting the cake, Oswald decided that he could entrust them to Honey. Christopher was shocked, thinking that it was strange to hear such words from a nephew towards his aunt. The protagonist hoped that the princess would not have any worries, and could quietly enjoy that day. The girl nodded, thinking that everything had pleased her very much, and that she was simply grateful. Annie didn't understand why either, but she liked the people here very much. As Christopher had known them when he was their age, he could assure that they were trustworthy people. After some thought, the Duke decided that he could not leave that broken music box. When she heard that he was planning to fix her, the protagonist was very surprised, a lot, believing that it was impossible. However, according to the Duke, the most skilled craftsman of the Empire worked there, capable of achieving it. Annie stared at the protagonist, realizing that soon she would be able to listen to that beautiful melody from the box again. Oswald decided to stay the night, and later, they lay down together at opposite ends of the bed. Lying on the bed, the girl remembered how she had been given that music box 2 years ago. The reason she had managed to survive until now was that Henny had hidden her from her mother. But that time, the girl forgot to hide the box, and that's why the tragedy happened. Somehow, incredibly, everything was able to start all over again, so it seemed that there was no reason to be alert anymore. However, looking at Oswald asleep now, Hanny decided not to let her guard down anymore. Approaching the boy and taking his hand, he decided to protect himself and his family. Unlike the protagonist's previous family, these people taught her completely new ways to show love, and the first one who made Honey feel that way was precisely Oswald. Determined to protect him until the end, the little girl fell asleep holding the child's hand between hers. The next morning, delicate feminine hands gently touched Hanny, trying to wake her up. When she opened her eyes, the girl saw Viola's cheerful face in front of her, smiling warmly at her. Annie was surprised, but it turned out that the maid could not leave without first greeting her mistress. The reason Viola was not present yesterday was because she was handing over her responsibilities, which surprised the princess. The little girl did not understand how it was possible that the emperor's maid, with the highest rank after the butler, came to work here. Viola decided to introduce herself again, announcing that from that day she would be the princess's personal maid. At yesterday's celebration, the protagonist looked for the girl, not wanting to leave without saying goodbye to her. Annie, of course, thought it would be great to still be together. However, it seemed strange to her that Her Majesty's maid should have to attend to an ordinary princess. But Viola replied that she considered this place the best place to work. Touched by the confused expression of the protagonist, the girls saw how a sleepy Oswald appeared behind the little one. The level of tenderness became critical, and the girl could hardly contain her urge to hug them all. Instead, she remembered how a few months ago, she was the first to see Honey's wound. Viola's heart trembled at the knowledge that the girl endured everything in silence, without making a single sound. He began to worry when he saw how the girl shrank and watched everything around her. And after several days, Honey shyly smiled and thanked him for the first time. Only then did Viola truly understand how good the princess was. At that moment, the maiden wanted to get to know her mistress even more, and decided to stay with her. Holding back tears, the protagonist wished that Viola would always be by her side from now on. When Oswald finished waking up and listened to the conversation, he threw himself on them with hugs full of affection. The maid remembered that she had woken the girl up because Empress Melissa would be arriving soon. The reason for his visit was to have clothes made especially for Honey, and that he would bring a tailor. The protagonist was confused and looked at Viola without understanding anything. It turned out that, in addition to Melissa and the tailor, Drake, Christopher, and His Highness Frederick had also arrived. The Duke only heard in passing that something was going on, and he decided to come and see. The Emperor had no important business today, and the captain was just accompanying him. The Empress had always wanted to do this together if she ever had a daughter, but she didn't think it would happen like this. The protagonist was sure that enough clothes had already been bought for her last time, but Melissa didn't think the same. In addition, the Empress wanted to give the princess a nice welcome gift to her new home. However, by the number of dresses, Honey thought that they had brought more than a whole store. Frederick was surprised that his wife wanted to try on all these dresses for the little one, but the girl did not see it complicated. At the beginning of the test, the princess showed each dress to the three heroes, who could not decide which one suited her best. One of the dresses was made of a special silk, and was much softer than the others, as a girl was going to wear it. The Empress paid special attention to comfort. When the test ended, the protagonist was exhausted after trying on dozens of dresses. To her surprise, Melissa decided to buy her all the clothes they had chosen. Realizing it was time to pay, Frederick, Christopher, and Drake pulled out their checks at the same time, but it turned out that the Empress had already paid for everything, leaving the heroes in shock. She ordered the checks to be signed every time Honey put on a new dress. Taking the girl in her arms, the Empress wondered if the princess had had a difficult day. Annie didn't understand why she was so tired. If she had spent the whole day sitting in the same place, Oswald promised to come right after school, and in the meantime, they took the protagonist to her room, where she fell asleep instantly. Over time, in the old palace of the protagonist, rumors were heard everywhere about the wonderful life in her new home. No matter how devilish Eleonora was, her daughter turned out to be the most adorable princess. Some thought that now everyone felt sorry for Honey, because she was a girl. But what would happen when I grew up? The maids of the girls' palace were happy because, since she arrived, Christopher also began to appear more often. And just now, walking through the palace gardens, the protagonist suddenly saw the Duke. The girl immediately ran to greet him, but the hero thought that running like this was dangerous. It turned out that she already knew that he was coming. That's why she went there to meet him as soon as possible. Looking carefully at her dress, Christopher suddenly began to take off his cape. When she wrapped the girl in it, she understood that it was cold, and that with such clothes, she could easily catch a cold. The protagonist tried to justify herself, saying that because of her strength, she could not feel cold, but the Duke would hear nothing. After that, with complete calm, he took her in his arms and went to the palace. Arriving with Frederick, he and the Emperor began to argue about the little girl's hairstyle. The Duke was surprised at how poorly his brother knew how to choose the right style. The main purpose of their meeting was to prepare to start the ice business. The project will be carried out on behalf of the Herne Peak, so now it was necessary to conquer the market in each region. The technical problems that Honey solved, thanks to his skill, could no longer be hidden. When he heard that a statement would have to be published, the Emperor was taken aback. The Duke wanted to announce to everyone that they had found a solution to the storage problem, but it was completely confidential. Just at that moment, he finished combing the girl, arranging her hair carefully. After that, he handed Frederick all the documents about the equipment, logistics, and also the budget plan. Seeing them, Honey had the impression that the heroes felt neither fear nor rejection towards their power. They were surprised, thinking that maybe she wanted them to be afraid of her. Hearing this, the protagonist immediately shook her head, because that was not what she wanted to say. The heroes were completely calm and saw no reason to be scared. However, Frederick admitted that there was a time when he got scared just because the girl had magical powers, and since the conversation was going that way, he also confessed that Oswald had abilities. Hearing that, Henny was shocked for a few seconds, taking in the information. Coming out of her trance, she exclaimed in surprise, looking at the Emperor with bewilderment. Then Frederick came up and stroked the girl's head, trying to calm her down a little. At first, the Emperor thought it was a coincidence how insightful the boy could be, but over time, it became clear that the Crown Prince had something akin to clairvoyance. It was the power of the God of Light, which left the protagonist confused again. From her past life, she already knew that that was the main god of the entire empire. He symbolized the light and the sun, and also had the gift of prophecy and the vision. Although Oswald's power does not always manifest itself, or depend on his will, he has already been a great help. The protagonist also knew that not only the Crown Prince had such an ability, but it wasn't the time yet. Now she understood that it was not an illusion, and that the boy really could see her through everything. And who knows, maybe that day, it was no coincidence that he was in that hallway, and saw how the maids were taking her away. That creature, with whom Henny was pained to death, generously gave her love to someone else. But if he really was Oswald, then the boy they called the Light was really loved by the Light. The protagonist began to be intrigued by how many more people knew about the Crown Prince's abilities. It turned out that almost every member of the imperial family was aware, in addition to about 5 other people, including the High Priest. So the girl wanted to know if she could now tell the boy about her own power. Frederick understood that this could lead to problems, and that it was better to wait a little. As he had said before, it would be safer if as few people as possible knew about the princess' power. Realizing the depth of her concerns, Henny apologized, thinking that she had said something silly. Later, leaving the palace next to the protagonist, Christopher noticed that she was down. Then, as if nothing had happened, he decided to clarify that soon the princess would have to start attending classes. The girl was very surprised, but the Duke understood that since she had become accustomed to the palace, she could start studying. At that moment, she realized how insightful the Duke was, because studying was Honey's most cherished dream. However, the little girl was too cautious. That's why Christopher only noticed it recently. If he just stayed in envy, nothing in his life would change. And what the hero had said earlier about helping her were not just empty words. Then the girl sincerely smiled and thanked Christopher for guessing her wish. After accompanying Hattie to the palace, the Duke returned with the Emperor, interrupting him. At his job, there was real horror and surprise on the Duke's face, so much so that Frederick was a little taken aback. The Emperor thought that his brother had forgotten something, but it turned out that it all had to do with the princess. According to the Duke, a teacher had to be hired for him as soon as possible. The Duke told the Emperor about the recent conversation with the little girl, saying that he wanted to comfort her, but Federico thought that it was still too early for her to start studying, although he himself learned from childhood. However, upon learning that the girl had asked for it on her own, Frederick immediately changed his mind. First of all, I wanted to know if there was anyone for the teaching position. Christopher proposed 2 masters, of whom the Emperor chose the most loyal, Sir Harvard. Once the decision was made, Federico personally sent him a letter asking him to come. Soon, the ice business was growing day by day, and rumors began to circulate. One day, Christopher overheard Oswald wondering if Honey might not be starting puberty. The protagonist was shocked by the surprise, and the Duke let out a giggle, covering his mouth with his hand. Honey looked at him hoping for help, but the Duke could barely contain his laughter. It turns out that the boy had seen those words in a book, and wanted to find out what they meant. It said there that teenagers try to bathe by themselves, just what the little one was doing while practicing magic. Then, making a pensive face, Christopher suggested that maybe it was puberty. Seeing the girl's look, he began to beg her to understand the joke. So the protagonist decided to explain to the crown prince that the princess just needed time to adapt to the new environment. That's why he was behaving like this. And the boy nodded convincingly. Oswald wasn't one to be fooled that easily, but it looks like Christopher pulled it off. As he looked ahead, the Duke realized with horror that everyone had already arrived. The boy began to hurry everyone, realizing that they were already late. They were on their way to a family dinner, which would be the first in Princess Hanny's life. As he entered the dining room, the Duke apologized for being a little late. He also offered a separate apology to Mother Empress Constance. In response, she smiled and proposed to Princess Honey to sit next to her. When she accepted, the little girl realized that it was the first time she had seen Her Majesty since she arrived at the palace. Melissa was puzzled by Oswald's hairstyle that Christopher had done for her. As everyone was already gathered, it was time to start, and soon the table was filled with culinary delights. Just by looking at the dishes, the protagonist's head would spin, and she would feel ferociously hungry. Constanza suggested to Hanny to start the meal with the salmon, which was very soft. As she put a small piece of fish in her mouth, the princess's eyes sparkled with pleasure. The Empress was very pleased that the little one appreciated the extraordinary taste of the dish. Then, he began to offer her other delicacies, while the Duke watched them attentively. He was very surprised when his mother had become so affectionate. When he and his brother were little, they didn't even dream of something like that, because Mom thought they could all do it alone. Constance was surprised that a grown man could envy her younger sister. Frederick smiled as he realized that his brother wanted Mom's affection so much, and did not want to give it up to his sister. So, the Emperor decided to take care of his brother himself, and put a piece of salmon on his plate. Then, he started stroking Christopher's head, telling him to chew many times. Frederick was trying to keep a serious expression, but he could hardly stand it anymore. The funniest thing was Christopher's face. He was in shock because of everything that was happening. Unable to contain himself, the Emperor and the others let out a laugh when they saw the confused face of the hero. After eating the fish, he thought Frederick could have fun, but not to go overboard. A few minutes later, Constance remembered that the princess was looking for a teacher at that moment. The Empress was a little sad that the little girl wanted to start studying so soon. Still, I was confident that the protagonist could do it all. Constance believed that in Huddy's small hands, there were a lot of possibilities, which would allow her to be whoever she wanted. That's why I wanted the girl not to listen to anyone and follow her heart, and not to rush either, because everything had its time. Even after the family dinner, the girl remembered those words, looking at her hands with a smile. Overall, he had loved today's meeting, and was a little sad that it was already over. Both on moving day and now, the protagonist really liked the atmosphere when everyone got together and spent time together. The Duke thought that there was nothing to regret, because there were still many nights like that ahead. Besides, when the princess saw what was waiting for her at the palace, she would be glad that everything had ended earlier than planned. It was something she had been looking forward to, and, after thinking about it for a while, Hanny looked at the hero in surprise. I thought that fixing the music box would take a long time, but thanks to the Duke's natural charm and generous wallet, they managed to come to an agreement. They immediately hurried to the palace, where Christopher handed the protagonist a small chest. When he opened it, he saw a music box that had been completely restored. Happy memories began to pass in front of the little girl's eyes, making her eyes sparkle. For several minutes, Hanny stared mesmerized at the gift, which until recently she did not even expect to see fixed. Taking it in her hands, the protagonist examined the music box with attention from all sides. The broken parts and the crystals had been replaced, and now it looked as if it was new. When the music turned on, the girl lay down next to it, with a sweet smile, really enjoying life. A while later, as she was leaving class, she unexpectedly bumped into Christopher. He greeted her back, and found out that the teacher had been so active that the little girl had to try very hard too. Normally, Harvard was not so energetic, but it seems that when he saw the protagonist, he found motivation. It turns out that today, the Duke left home for the first time in the last 3 days. To Honey's surprise, the reason for the Duke's occupation turned out to be Oswald. The boy wanted to walk with the princess through the streets, so Christopher was looking for how to occupy his time. However, now I was curious to know if the little one would agree to go for a walk. The girl's eyes sparkled with excitement, and she gladly accepted, realizing that it would be the first time she would leave the palace. The walk was planned for the next day, as the Duke needed to recover a little. For now, it was necessary to concentrate on work, and Hani had to make about 20 particles of condensed air. After so much training, he created the ice particles in the air much more easily and elegantly. Gathering them into a little bag, he handed it to the Duke without any trouble. Christopher thanked her, and noticed that Honey had become even more skilled at it. Perhaps the conversations about puberty influenced, which made the little girl lower her eyebrows with irony. Anyway, as always, he fulfilled his task perfectly. The next day, disguised as commoners, the three heroes were preparing to leave. Oswald was fascinated that, even in that dress, Hani still looked just as adorable. In those clothes, she felt like she was really going out, and her heart was beating harder. Looking at the Duke, the girl was surprised to see a huge sword in his belt. It turned out that the hero did not handle it very well, but he took it with him just in case. Anyway, on this topic it was better to trust Christopher, since he only knew the basics. The father had told Oswald that his uncle was better at martial arts than fencing. Looking at the Duke, Hani understood that such a physique is achieved only with a lot of training. In addition, the previous emperor usurped the throne, which upset many rich people and made them political enemies. For this reason, the childhood of her two eldest children was certainly not at all peaceful. After a while, the heroes finally arrived at the shopping street of the imperial capital. The heroine was impressed by the number of things, from products to people. The first thing Christopher did was to tell the children that they should not leave alone or follow strangers. He made them repeat all the rules until they knew them by heart. After a few minutes, the children were finally free, and sighed with relief. As we started walking down the street, the eyes of the heroes went from one side to the other. What surprised Hani the most was the variety of fruits on the street stalls. He was also struck by the variety of fish, and how they used the ice they produced. Compared to the palace, the atmosphere was totally different, and that made the girl very happy. Seeing a corn dog vendor, Oswald was curious to know what they were. Having no idea, Christopher proposed to the children to try them with the money he gave them. The saleswoman was happy to see such nice customers, and told them the price. Taking out their little bags and making simple beads, the heroes gathered the necessary amount, especially for children. The woman chose the largest and most appetizing corn dogs, with a lot of sauce. The children looked hypnotized at this unknown delight, from which an irresistible aroma of meat came out. The taste of such a delicacy turned out to be incredibly delicious, making every cell of the body filled with joy. After trying a few more types of street food, the children were surprised to find that their money had disappeared while they were still walking along the shopping street. One of the shops caught Hani's attention. They were jewels, and among them stood out something very special. It was about 3 bracelets with a deep name, "Give your unbreakable heart to the one you love." Knowing that the children no longer had any money, Christopher offered to pay the same. Oswald and Honey put on a bracelet each, looking satisfied at the ornament. The third bracelet was given to the Duke, who considered it a very touching gesture. As she moved forward, the protagonist raised her head, and suddenly became paralyzed on the spot. In the distance, above the houses and the forest, stood the gigantic and snowy McCloud Mountain. It was the tallest mountain in the entire empire, visible from anywhere. An incredibly intense cold, right in the center of the country, had instilled terror in the inhabitants of the empire for 500 years. Turning her head, Hani saw a kind fruit seller, smiling at the young shopper. The protagonist knew that, if everyone discovered her abilities, no one would smile at her again. Meanwhile, the heroes gradually climbed to the top of Herne, where the district administrative building was located. A young man, concentrating on working at his desk, was surprised to see that someone entered the building. When he realized that it was the Duke, the boy was so frightened that he began to tremble. He did not understand what had brought His Highness there, while Christopher was surprised by his reaction. The reason was that on his last visit, the Duke had left him a lot of work. Finding out that he was just going for a walk today, the guy calmed down and decided to meet the children. The Duke introduced him to the Crown Prince and the Princess, which left the young man completely surprised. It turned out that the guy's name was Bob, and he was the one who ran the district from the top of Herne. Since His Highness had come anyway, Bob wanted to give Christopher some documents to review. The Duke hoped that, while he was away for a moment, the children would wait for him quietly without leaving the room. He really believed that, as long as they were there, nothing could happen to them. That was until suddenly, while looking thoughtfully out of the window, Honey saw something terrible. By abruptly getting up from the chair, she greatly frightened Oswald, leaving him confused, running towards the street. He hoped that the boy would call Christopher as quickly as possible. Despite Oswald's objections, he could not ignore an adult's mistreatment of a child. As she ran out, the protagonist began to desperately look for the gentlemen who were accompanying them. As she turned the corner, she finally saw Scott and the others, who were surprised to see her arrive. The knights did not understand why the young princess was alone on the city street. It was too dangerous, and Scott wanted to know exactly what had happened to him. Seizing the young gentleman by the hands, she began to beg him to go with her and help the poor girl. Scott looked confused at the other warriors who silently nodded, taking the young lady in his arms. He and the others quickly headed towards where she indicated. Suddenly, Hanny saw a terrifying scene in front of her, which made her disobey the Duke's order. Furious that the little girl denied having money, the adult threw her aside. Without believing her, he took a glass bottle to force her to hand over the money. However, according to the girl, the man had already taken everything from her 2 days ago. Through tears, she began to beg him to come to his senses, because it was impossible to raise more money in such a short time. Determined to check the story, the man raised the bottle to threaten the girl, but suddenly, a gentleman held his arm, considering that such a method was too dangerous. At the same time, Scott turned Honey around so she wouldn't see what was going on. He also asked the victim to turn around, promising that he would take care of everything. The man began to get upset, insulting the gentleman and trying to get loose. Then, one of them made a quick movement, and with a precise blow, took the bottle from the unfortunate man's hands. Seeing that it had been a girl, the enraged man threw himself at her with his fists, blocking the blow without problems. The horsewoman left the man completely bewildered, knocking him down and kicking him hard. He slammed him against the wall of the house, holding the place of the blow. The man was trembling with pain and pure terror. Then, another knight came up and pointed his sword at his head, hoping that would finally calm him down. Suddenly, the man saw next to him the same bottle that had been taken from his hand. Mad with fear and rage, he shouted to the soldiers to stay out of what they didn't care about, and threw the bottle forward. Scott managed to catch her just a second before she got to Honey's head. With a sinister smile, the gentleman thought that the man had already crossed all the boundaries. After that, the painful moans of the man began to be heard behind the princess, so she covered her ears. Pulling out a rope, the gentleman decided to make things right, and tied him up. Beaten beyond recognition, the man, even while tied up, kept insulting the heroes. Then Scott couldn't take it anymore, and knocked him out with a blow to the neck, leaving everyone in shock. Annie looked at the injured girl, in whose eyes distrust and contempt were noticeable. The princess decided to make sure that the rescued little girl was okay. The girl realized that it was the princess who asked the soldiers for help. But did the naive heroine really think that the girl would be grateful to her for that? She did not care about such help at all, and looked at her saviors with disdain. Seeing an aristocrat helping someone is no longer pleasant, and hurts more when she does it out of pure greed. Fearing that later all the anger would fall on her and her mother, the girl asked for the heroine's compassion to be returned to her. Annie tried to explain that she acted out of true empathy, but the girl did not want to listen to anything. It bothered her to receive sympathy from someone who walks around with 3 guards, and asks to be called madam. Seeing that the gentleman tensed up, the heroine made a hand signal to them not to intervene. The girl was right when she said that Hanny knew nothing about that world. But I did know very well what it hurts to be beaten. That's why he went to help. She was curious to know if the girl knew Princess Hanny, Eleonora's daughter, which frightened her very much. Seeing that reaction, the heroine showed him her hand, full of scars from the constant blows. Before, Hanny was in so much pain that she wanted to die, but thanks to the help of others, I could now live happily. Among those others, there were also the 3 knights who accompanied and protected her. That's why the princess wanted to help. when she saw an adult hurting a girl, it wasn't just an act of kindness by an ignorant aristocrat. The heroine wanted to share what she herself had received. Therefore, Hani invited the girl to go to the imperial palace together, if her parents allowed her. At that moment, behind the protagonist, a furious Christopher appeared, carrying Oswald under his arm. Annie was glad to see them, but the girl was frightened when she saw more aristocrats arriving. Both heroes began to ask questions at the same time, wanting to know what had happened, and if the princess was injured. The Duke was shocked by her sudden flight, while the little girl only smiled guiltily. One of the gentlemen offered to explain everything that had happened to the gentleman in detail. However, looking at the girl and the tied man, the hero was already beginning to suspect what had happened. After listening to the gentleman's account, the Duke learned that the victim's name was Judy. She confessed that the man who attacked her was her own father. They had never had to work, since their family had a shop, inherited from grandfather. At some point, the father became addicted to gambling, and when he ran out of money, he gambled the house and the store, losing everything. Then, the father started drinking and forced her and her mother to work to get money, which he gambled again. The mother's friends and neighbors tried to help her get a divorce, but that only made the man angrier. Judy knew she had no problem. Sorry for offending Her Highness, but the protagonist perfectly understood her feelings and hoped that the girl would allow her to help her. Christopher supported the princess, thinking that if they had already started helping, they should finish what they had started. Then, Judy dared to ask for help so that her mother could get a divorce. Although the topic was not even discussed, such an opportunity does not come along often. That's why the Duke wanted the girl to ask for everything she could. Besides, now Christopher and Henny could completely help her with all the problems. Judy was shocked, still coming to terms with what she had done, heard, and unable to believe what was happening. Later, the heroes were walking around chatting about the protagonist's admission to the prestigious National Academy. Annie was able to quietly concentrate on her studies, while Christopher helped Judy. At that moment, Oswald and the princess began to take turns, praising the hero, saying that he was cool, smart, and rich. Then the Duke decided to add that he also had power, and they all laughed together. However, he hoped that Henny was not joking, so that he would forget about the escape. That day, the princess had to return to the palace and learn a child safety rule. Judy's father was imprisoned, and she and her mother organized her life so that the girl could get into the academy. Sudden changes in the family caught the attention of neighbors, who never knew who had helped them. In addition to classes with the teacher, the protagonist now took etiquette lessons with Mrs. Melissa. After studying so hard, Henny lowered her sugar and eagerly threw herself into sweets. Sitting at the table with the Empress, the girl suddenly saw that Melissa began to cough loudly. Suddenly, the Empress got up from her chair, kept coughing, and began to complain of pain. Annie was left in shock, not understanding what was going on, and desperately trying to think of a plan. Suddenly, the protagonist realized that all that time, the Empress had been pregnant. In her past life, Eleonora poisoned Melissa, also killing the baby she was carrying in her womb. Eventually, the pregnancy was confirmed, and Frederick and Constance came to congratulate the Empress. The children were there too, and Oswald was incredibly happy to know that he would have a brother or sister. It had been 8 years since new grandchildren had been born, so Constance proposed to have a party. Melissa thought it would be great if the whole country could be happy about this event, but first we had to visit the Temple of the God of Light and pray for the well-being of the baby. Annie also joined in the congratulations, for which she received a sincere thank you. The Empress could no longer wait to see how beautiful that baby would be at birth. Eleonora was no longer there. No one was going to poison the lady, but still, the protagonist felt a great restlessness in her heart. A few days later, the Emperor, his wife and the children finally left for the Temple of the God of the Light. There they were received by Father Calvin. Accompanied by monks from the temple, they greeted the distinguished guests and the servants of the God of Light with a bow, wishing them the strength of the wind. Kelvin suddenly fixed his gaze on the protagonist. Annie was greatly puzzled by this. While the father began to converse with the emperor, Kelvin was overjoyed to learn that His Highness and the others had arrived safely. They talked about formal things, but it seemed that Frederick and the father were friends and felt comfortable together. After the talk, Everyone went to the main chapel, where there was a stone statue of the god of light. First everyone made a bow, and then purified their lips and hands with holy water. Then the moment came when everyone started praying on their knees. For a while, the protagonist watched as everyone prayed, closing their eyes and opening their heart to God. Then, he turned his gaze to the statue of the god of light, remembering the past. Before she died, she had prayed a lot, and now she was doing it again. Annie was almost sure that her prayer would not be heard, but she hoped that at least once, God would not ignore her. The girl sincerely wished that Melissa and Frederick's child would be born safe and sound. At the end of the ceremony, the emperor wanted to leave for a moment to talk to Kelvin. Upon accepting, the father suggested that the children take a walk around the church grounds. While listening to her words about the beautiful flowers of the place, the protagonist felt something strange inside, as if something was not right. Unlike her, Oswald was looking at Kelvin with his eyes wide open, as if he were hypnotized. The girl did not understand why they had to go somewhere, but suddenly the crown prince insisted that they go out for a walk. As she left, Hanny couldn't shake the feeling that the Holy Father had been watching her in a strange way. Suddenly, a terrifying thought came to his mind, that Kelvin might discover his abilities. Scott and his companion accompanied the children, and the gentleman did not stop admiring the spring landscapes all the way. Scott thought he would like to have a little brother like Oswald, and his companion would be happy with a sister who knew fencing. Suddenly, a garden of indescribable beauty appeared before the heroes, full of fragrant flowers and spring colors. The children were paralyzed with amazement, and the adults opened their mouths in shock, putting on a thoughtful face. Oswald remembered that must be somewhere out there. Without understanding what he was looking for there, the protagonist suddenly felt like a shadow completely covered her. Something flew by like lightning, right over their heads, leaving everyone bewildered. The knights immediately rushed to the princess and the crown prince to protect them from an unexpected enemy. Scott grabbed Hanny and made a sharp jump, quickly moving away to the side. Then he fell to the ground, holding the little girl in front of him and pressing her to his chest. Whatever it was, the hero was glad that the attempt to harm the children had failed. Her partner wanted them to stay there while she took care of the enemy, but suddenly, to his surprise, the boy thought that what had happened was not so serious. Looking at the place where the unexpected visitor landed, the gentleman was petrified with amazement. In front, between them and Scott with Honey, was a huge tiger with a four-pointed star on his forehead. The princess was cautiously looking at the hairy giant, not understanding who he was or where he had come from. She was the sacred creature of this look, blessed by the god of light, and her name was Light. Hearing this from Oswald, the heroine did not understand why the sacred tiger had suddenly appeared in front of her. Seeing that Light was starting to approach the princess, Scott stepped between them, drawing his sword. Annie thought that, because of his power, the tiger saw her as an enemy that he should get rid of. Oswald rushed to calm the heroes down, since according to him, Light had no intention of attacking. On the contrary, the tiger was very happy to see them, but he was upset because they blocked his way. As he approached the boy, Light held out to him the paw in greeting, which surprised him very much. But suddenly, Oswald raised his index finger and scolded the tiger, because Light had almost hurt Honey, so he had to think carefully about his behavior. The tiger's ears immediately pulled down, he closed his eyes, and a lonely tear rolled down by his cheek. Approaching the heroine, the guy first made sure that she was really not hurt. Annie thought she was fine thanks to Scott, although the hero was convinced that he was just doing his duty. Besides, compared to what Commander Drake usually does, this was nothing. But Honey kept praising him, and Oswald joined her. That kind of praise was the best that the young gentleman could receive in his service, although it made him a little nervous. Suddenly, the tiger crept up behind the princess and pushed her with his head, scaring her quite a lot. His eyes were very kind, although according to Oswald, Light was especially naughty today. As he got closer to Hanny, the boy thought that she probably felt something weird too when Kelvin sent them here. Then the heroine understood that he knew everything, and that he was guided by his intuition. Annie looked intently at Oswald and Light, who had received the blessing of the god of light. She found that couple incredibly tender, although that left the gentleman totally confused. How could a 4-meter tall tiger, with a tail thicker than a doll, look cute? Light approached the girl and leaned her muzzle on her little hands. Then he started purring. Of course he had seen wild animals on the snowy mountain, but this one transmitted warmth to him, as if it were the sun. The children together began to caress the happy predator, who had an expression of pure pleasure in his eyes. The obedient kitten was giving them the paw, which left the heroes completely fascinated. Scott had heard that this creature wasn't exactly friendly, so now he was really surprised. But Hanny thought that he was just a big, stray cat that needed affection and attention. Suddenly, Captain Drake's confused exclamation was heard from the side. The Emperor, accompanied by the captain and the church servants, was making his way towards them. Upon seeing the tiger, Drake demanded an explanation of what was going on there. Patting himself on the forehead, Kelvin thought that it had been a long time since Light had appeared here. Frederick and the others noticed that, next to the kitten, the princess looked tiny. Annie was outraged, since she did not consider herself small, and then the Emperor personally apologized. The Holy Father promised that from now on they would be more careful and try to prevent something like this from happening. If the day came when the girl needed his help, Kelvin was ready to make up for his mistake. The protagonist remembered him, thinking that he could be useful if one day his power manifested. Suddenly, the tiger came up to him and licked his palm, playfully closing his eyes. Annie took it as an apology, while the servants, including Kelvin, were shocked, because they knew that animal as a capricious one who would not even let them touch him. When Frederick gave the order to leave, Light's eyes suddenly changed. It was very difficult for him to say goodbye to the girl, even to tears, but there was nothing to do. Then, Honey tied one of her bows on his little paw, hoping that the tiger would keep it until they met again. Together with all the servants, Light went out to say goodbye to the heroes, and waved his little paw with the bow to say goodbye. The next morning, the princess was sleeping peacefully in her bed and dreaming beautiful things. Suddenly, between dreams, the girl felt her hand touching something that looked like fur. Embracing what felt like a soft and warm cloud, the protagonist sighed sweetly. Suddenly, a thought crossed his mind, and he woke up instantly, jumping up and taking off the blanket. She screamed, surprised to see a small tiger, but at that very moment, she recognized Light in the visitor, and was very glad to see him. The protagonist was surprised that the tiger could be made as small as a simple orange cat. After saying this, Light made a graceful move, and gracefully jumped out of the bed onto the floor. When he touched the floor, he turned back into a huge tiger, and smiled at Honey. The princess understood that he had been punished yesterday for throwing himself at her in that way. Honey was thanking Light for coming, but if anyone else saw him, there would be a fuss. Just at that moment, Gerda came in very happy, wanting to wake up to life. The princess, when she saw the huge tiger next to the bed, she became paralyzed and screamed in terror. Regaining his composure, he asked His Highness not to make a single noise. Throwing herself on the floor, the maid crawled like a spy to the bed, looking at the animal in fear. Grabbing the girl, she ran out of the room at full speed, screaming desperately for help. Because of their screams, there was a great commotion in the palace, and everyone was confused. Later, alone with Honey and Light, Frederick listened to the story of her sudden appearance, calmly holding the kitten in his arms. The princess was sure that he had come to see her. What surprised the Emperor the most was that the tiger had even brought his things, neatly arranged in a basket. That meant that, apparently, Light was not planning to return. Realizing where the conversation was going, the little tiger jumped out of the heroine's arms and ran to the basket. Rummaging through his things, Light took out a large emerald, and with a satisfied face, handed it to the Emperor. Frederick understood that, apparently, in the temple, they had not yet noticed his absence, but Light had to come back yes or yes. So, the Emperor decided to talk to the cat alone, and asked Hanny to come out for a moment. The hero waited for the girl to leave the office before he started talking. Looking at the cat, the Emperor confessed that even he could not decide the fate of the divine goods, and even if he could, the fact that the sacred beast had left the temple for the princess wouldn't benefit anyone. In that case, Hanny would receive much more attention than before. That might help his status, but considering his ice powers, it might also cause him more problems than advantages. From Light's look, Frederick understood that the cat did not see any problem in what he had just heard. However, Honey was also the next candidate for the throne, after Oswald and Christopher, and if his name was related to a divine creature, aristocrats with ulterior motives could take advantage of it. As an older brother, Frederick thanked the cat for his kindness to his sister, but he did not want to complicate things further. Hoping that he would understand, the Emperor ordered Light to return to the temple immediately. Realizing that there was no other option, the cat disappeared into the air, leaving behind a golden trail. Seeing the remaining basket, Frederick wondered if Light had forgotten it or if he had decided not to give up. Calling Charles, the Emperor ordered him to take the basket back to the temple and make sure that rumors were not spread. 2 weeks later, Frederick was back in his office working with documents. Suddenly, a red-haired cat appeared out of nowhere. He perched on the desk and looked at the ruler earnestly. The Emperor hoped that the animal would have the decency to get down on the ground immediately. Suddenly, the cat spat out an envelope in front of Frederick, and then calmly left the desk. The letter was from Kelvin himself, and he was completely drooling over the cat. There he said that this animal would not be stubborn for no reason, and that it was better that he stayed in the palace. Hearing that, after reading the letter, the Emperor admitted defeat. Light jumped for joy, but his fur bristled when he heard that Frederick had 2 conditions. Only by fulfilling them, the cat could stay here, otherwise, I would have to go back. Sitting down and abusing his ears, Light prepared to listen attentively to His Highness. The first condition was that no one, except the imperial family and the closest allies, should know about the presence of the sacred animal. The second condition was much more important than the first, and the Emperor came up to whisper it. As he said both conditions, Frederick noticed that the tiger's gaze became more serious. Taking a step forward, Light raised his head and stared into the Emperor's eyes. Frederick took this as a sign that the negotiations were over. When he saw how the cat licked his paw with complete calmness, something seemed strange to the Emperor. Suddenly, Honey walked into her office, happy to see Light. Frederick did not understand what it was that the divine animal was so interested in that girl. The protagonist was very excited to find out that the tiger would stay to live in the palace. He was very insistent, but if something happened, Frederick could just pretend that nothing had happened and send the cat back. And he didn't even dream about Light liking her so much, or that they could spend so much time together. The Emperor could not help but be touched to see how friends promise to always get along. Now, I thought that there was nothing strange about a divine being liking such a wonderful child. Besides, now the princess had a fairly reliable bodyguard. A month later, when it first became known that there was ice on the top of Herne, the reaction was mostly negative. This was because the ice business had a reputation for quickly bankrupting entrepreneurs. However, Christopher managed to become the #1 on the market in just 1 month, thanks to stability and low prices. He also managed to equalize the prices of ice, regardless of the season, and eliminate illegal traders, thanks to the Duke's contacts. And now, sitting in the pavilion next to his brother, he felt as if he were neither alive nor dead. Frederick understood that in that state, it was probably difficult to devote oneself to business. Not far from them, on the lawn, Melissa was sitting with the children, laughing and chatting animatedly. Christopher had already heard rumors about the divine beast and wanted to see it, but he was probably dozing off somewhere right now. At first, the Emperor was worried about him, but now he understood that his fears were unfounded. She got along so well with Hanny that the cat was willing to bring her a basket full of jewelry. The Duke was puzzled, not understanding where the animal had gotten all that. Had he stolen from the Holy Father? But it turned out that all these riches really belonged to him. It was strange, because normally the divine beings of the temple are not interested in human jewelry, but this cat was different, and he was willing to do anything in order to win the love of the protagonist. Recently, the children gave the tiger a new nickname, as the name Light symbolized their relationship with the god of light. Upon learning that he was called Puff, Christopher almost choked on his tea. Although the tiger was still a child by the standards of the divine beasts, being the size of a house, the name Puff didn't suit him very well. Meanwhile, Melissa and the children continued to laugh and chat animatedly about different topics. Annie was curious. Did the lady want a boy or a girl? After thinking about it, the Empress decided that she would have preferred a daughter first, since she already had a son, but now she didn't care who she was, because Hani was like a real daughter to Melissa. From such tenderness, the protagonist almost had steam coming out of her ears, and turned all red, which made the Empress laugh. Oswald was sitting with an expression of genuine joy, laughing along with the others. The Duke was watching the boy attentively, thinking over various ideas, and deciding to talk to him. Frederick was surprised that he wanted to take Oswald with him, as he was planning to make more ice with Honey's help. However, Christopher insisted that today yes, he would take the crown prince. Later, the Duke helped her pack her things while they chatted. The boy was surprised that his uncle helped him. Note how tired I was. Suddenly, the Duke was curious to know if the prince felt unhappy about having to share everything with Hani, because until then, absolutely everything in the family had been only his since he was born. Thinking about it, the boy remembered that he had already been asked that question when Hani just arrived at the palace. At that moment, a maid wanted to know what Oswald thought if the princess made him less wanted in the family. However, he was sure that the fact that Dad and Mom loved the girl did not mean that they were going to love him less. The crown prince never thought he shared anything with her. On the contrary, they received enough love together, and this applied not only to the two of them and Honey, also to the unborn baby. Oswald thought his uncle had nothing to worry about. Meanwhile, Christopher was in shock. After laughing, he realized that he had gotten to know his nephew better today when he grabbed it and started to guide it. He left Oswald totally confused, and when he called him his little one, Oswald was even more surprised, because his parents were Frederick and Melissa. Standing behind the door, Honey heard that Christopher was considering his brother's son as yours too. The protagonist had decided to arrive early and bring an ice pack, but now everything had taken an unexpected turn. The crown prince did not even imagine how much strength his sincere love gave the girl, and although she was still afraid and unsure, thanks to how bright the boy was, the protagonist could move forward, even from the shadows. Annie wanted the soon-to-be-born baby to receive so much love too. The next day, sitting at the table, Melissa distracted herself from the newspaper to say something to the princess, but to her surprise, the little girl was sleeping soundly, lying on the back of the chair. Upon hearing the Empress' voice, the girl immediately jumped up, pretending that she was not asleep. Melissa proposed to cancel the classes so she could rest, but Henny really wanted to study. Apologizing for having worried everyone, the protagonist hurried to her lesson. As she watched the princess walk away, Melissa thought that she probably felt bad about the change of seasons, and seriously worried about her and the prince. So she decided to write a letter to Christopher and prepare a medicinal infusion for the children. It seemed that the summer of this year was going by especially fast, perhaps because of the amount of things that were happening. The Empress believed that this year really would be etched in her memory forever. Meanwhile, someone in a dark cloak was standing in front of the palace entrance, watching everything that happened. In a dimly lit room, Melissa's body lay on the floor. She could barely keep breathing. Agnes arrived just in time. He managed to neutralize the poison and save the Empress, but the baby in her womb was already dead. Upon receiving this news, the protagonist felt overwhelming terror and total despair. Eleonora, like a monster, hugged the little girl's body and let out a sinister laugh. The woman did not understand how a being as horrible as Henny could dare to think that he deserved to be happy. At that moment, the girl woke up soaked in cold sweat, trembling with fear all over her body. With difficulty breathing, he gradually began to recover from what he had seen. That night, he again could not sleep well, and began to rub his eyes with fatigue. The fact that Eleonora had died did not mean that everything was over. The woman's accomplice, who helped her poison the Empress, was still in the palace. The problem was that the little girl knew absolutely nothing about him. His mind was in a mess, and he decided to go out and get some fresh air. It was the middle of the night outside, and hearing a noise in the distance, the girl became alert. There he saw a person watching the palace, dressed in a dark cloak. On the back of the cape, there was a drawing of a rum's skull, which made it look even more sinister. When she remembered something, Hanny fell to the ground, paralyzed by fear that suddenly invaded her, and is that he had already encountered that cape before, just before returning. That time, He was wandering around the palace where he lived with his mother, looking for something to eat. Suddenly, he saw at the end of the corridor a person in such a cloak, talking to Eleonora. He managed to hear that they were working on something, and the woman agreed to wait a little. At that moment, the girl was hiding behind a nearby chest of drawers, and did not understand who that person was, or what that cloak was, and now it was happening again, at the same time, in the same clothes. And besides, the stranger's behavior was very suspicious. The protagonist had almost no doubts that this was Eleonora's accomplice. However, at that distance it was impossible to see his face. Besides, he was on his back. If you looked at the skirt, it looked like it was someone from the service, sitting on the grass and sighing sadly. Hanny thought it would be great to know more. She felt it was her duty to discover the identity of the person with the cape and protect Miss Melissa. Suddenly Puffik appeared, and the protagonist stared at him. He came up with the idea of sending the cat with the Empress as a personal bodyguard. The girl hoped that the divine beast would fulfill her request, because only he could protect the young lady without anyone noticing. The cat meowed affirmatively, and the little girl, thanking him, let him go. At that very moment, he vanished into thin air, leaving behind a golden glow. Suddenly, the girl heard a strange noise, and the rustling of leaves behind her. She got really scared when she realized that it looked like someone else had decided to come. Hiding, she began to watch from her shelter to see who would come out of the forest. Suddenly, another person with a dark cape came out, but this time without drawings. Thinking that he was another accomplice of Eleonora, the protagonist tried to see his face. Seeing that it was a small child, Hanny exclaimed in surprise. At that very moment she realized that she had just been discovered. Noticing that the boy had red hair, the protagonist suddenly understood everything. The hero was very surprised to find himself here with his sister, coming out of her hiding place and looking at him confused. Hanny was also surprised to see Terence in this place. Although the previous emperor had an adult wife, Constance, with 2 children, took 2 more wives. When he died, he left 4 descendants, including Hanny, daughter of Eleonora, and Terence, son of the second wife. And now, the protagonist unexpectedly bumped into the little ex-prince. I did not understand what the child was doing here. If his family almost never went out in public. Thinking a little, Terence decided that he couldn't tell his little sister that. Moreover, the princess was here in pajamas, not to mention slippers. Being part of the royal family, the protagonist had to behave as such. Annie was shocked by such impudence, not understanding how someone could look at others like that. He admitted that he had just gone out for some fresh air, and ended up coming here. After that, an awkward silence filled the atmosphere, making the girl feel uncomfortable. Realizing that he probably didn't have anything anymore, nothing more to say, Terence turned around and started to leave. The princess knew that it was about a 40-minute walk to her palace. That meant that the child was hiding something. Could it be that his family was also involved in the poisoning? The next morning, the little girl was standing by the window, remembering what happened in the evening, and then went to see Melissa. She was worried about Terence's unexpected visit, but the most important thing now was to protect the Empress. Knowing that the culprit could be one of the maids, Hanny suddenly bumped into them in the hallway. The girls were carrying some boxes, and they didn't understand why the princess was there at that hour. The protagonist stared at the maids, who smiled kindly at her in response. The girl knew little about them, only that one of the maids had been working for the Empress for a long time. Seeing his serious little face, the girls thought that His Highness must have an important matter. They thought that Henny was in pajama, because her servitude did not do her job well, but the girl reassured them. She had just had a nightmare with her mom, and decided to go to Mrs. Melissa as soon as possible. Moved by what they heard, the maids decided to split up. One would accompany the young princess, and the other would take care of the medicines. Annie was very surprised to learn that in her boxes there were medicines that Christopher had sent at the request of the Empress. When she heard the Duke's name, the little girl was paralyzed with fear, turning over many thoughts. Now, if she wasn't attentive, the malicious ones might even try to blame Christopher. After that, he went as fast as he could towards the Empress. Melissa did not expect such an early visit from the little princess, and was surprised. The protagonist wished her good morning, and was glad to see the lady full of energy and in good health. The Empress was curious to know what had caused such an early visit. With a sad look, the girl confessed that she had had a nightmare. That's why he decided to stay with Melissa, which made her immediately get up and run to the little one, hugging the girl tightly. The Empress tried to push all the horrible thoughts of the dream away from her head, because according to her, it was just a dream that would never come true. At that moment, Hani remembered how Melissa's body lay on the ground, almost lifeless. However, he believed that, just as the lady said, that dream was not destined to come true. The Empress ordered the servants to notify the princess's palace where she was, bring her clothes, and prepare breakfast. In addition, she wanted the maids to prepare a medicinal infusion, so that she could take it after eating. It turns out that this brevity was for the little one. As a way to take care of her health, the protagonist was shocked to find out, thinking that if the medicines were for her, then what about the poison? Upon learning that part of the medicines were also for Oswald, Henny was scared, believing that he was sick. But in reality, Melissa thought that he could use an extra boost for his immunity too. After all, the guy had a special power, which left the little girl completely confused. When he was born, he was very weak, but then he started to get better, and now there were no problems anymore. Even so, Melissa was still worried, like any mother, and she took the same care of Hanny. That's why I hoped that, even if the short came out bitter, the girl would be able to hold on a little. After that, the princess stayed with Melissa, waiting for the servants who were supposed to bring her clean clothes. I was happy because today, I could spend the whole day with the Empress. Now there was no way to check the kitchen, so all that remained was to stay close and not let down your guard. Soon, two maids arrived together, which surprised the lady a little. One of them, the one who had been with the Empress the longest, had already told everything in the kitchen and breakfast was almost ready. Melissa was grateful and glad that everything was fine. But there was something that worried the girls. They spent a long time thinking about whether they should tell the Empress, and finally decided to confess it. Apparently, the third maid had some kind of problem. That's why she always walked around with a sad face. The other servants failed to find out anything. And then Melissa decided to personally pay attention to him. Besides, the girls remembered that that maid had gone out at night somewhere. This was evidenced by the fact that his coat was not in place at that time. The little girl was horrified to think that surely that person with the cape was her. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and it turned out to be just the maid they were talking about. Finally, everyone was gathered, and both ladies headed to the dining room. Sitting down at the table, the first thing they did was that several waiters brought them some pickled mushrooms as a light appetizer. The protagonist was completely tense, carefully waiting for the moment of poisoning. However, the food was fine, and the Empress along with the princess started to eat. Looking at the short-headed maiden they were talking about earlier, it was obvious that something was not right with her. But could someone planning a murder really be that nervous? Suddenly, the protagonist noticed the furious look of the maid, who had been working with Melissa the longest. Just with that look, the girl's hands started shaking so much that she couldn't use the cutlery. The Empress, for her part, was having breakfast quietly, with a completely unconcerned expression. Suddenly, the Empress took the glass of water, which made Hanny even more tense. At that moment, the girl remembered that the poison was in the cup with the hot drink. Something had to be done urgently, but unfortunately the protagonist could not warn Her Majesty of anything. Just then, one of the maids brought a tray with 2 cups of infusion. Melissa had only ordered 1, but the person who gave the infusion to the maid thought that the future baby could also use something healthy. The Empress thought it was a very tender gesture on the part of the girl, and gladly accepted. Annie watched attentively as the maid put both cups on the table, suspicious of her. But the girl was surprised that it was precisely that maid, who had been working for the lady for more than 10 years, measuring the temperature of the drink with a probe. The girl proposed to the little girl to do the same. When accepting, the protagonist noticed how the maiden watched her very carefully in every movement. When taking out the rod, he accidentally touched the cup, tipping it over on the table and spilling its contents. Annie started to apologize, but Melissa reassured her, as the important thing was that she had not fallen on the clothes. In that case, he asked the maid to prepare the infusion again, and the girl accepted with a smile. After her departure, the protagonist had a little time to try to report everything to Her Majesty. The first thing the little girl did was open the window and call her pet, hoping he could help her. Stroking his muzzle, he was glad that Puffik was safe and hoped that everything would be fine with him. He decided to send a letter to the emperor through him. Although there was no paper nearby, there was no other option, so the protagonist wrote the letter directly on a table napkin. Now, the cat was to urgently go before His Majesty and deliver the message as quickly as possible. Just as she disappeared, one of the maids wanted to change Her Majesty's clothes. It was a girl named Fedora, who was said to have been walking around with her face down lately. After dressing Mrs. Hanny in a dress, he asked her to stay a moment to tell him something. However, at the same time she began to hesitate, as if she could not find the right words. Holding her hand, Fedora, with a face full of despair, looked at the floor. So, the girl decided to directly ask if the girl knew that there was something in the infusion. After that, the maid's face was filled with horror, and her entire body was covered with cold sweat. It turned out that it was not her thing. Since she would never have done such a thing, Fedora confessed that there was poison in the cup with the infusion, which left the protagonist in shock. The girl was very sorry, and it was noticeable that she seemed to have been forced to participate. It was not the time, but later the protagonist was waiting to hear from her the details of what happened. Moreover, Hanny was sincerely grateful to the girl for her bravery, and for confessing it. Thanks to her, the princess was now completely safe, and ran back to the empress. When she returned, the girl did not know whether it was better to tell everything right now and ask for help. At that moment, Melissa was sitting in front of the protagonist and read a magazine quietly. Annie decided not to say it out front. I didn't want to just let him go like that anymore. In the end, the truth would come out, and the little girl hoped that it would not be a very hard blow for the lady. Seeing that the maid came in again with a tray, the protagonist decided to wait for the right moment. After checking the temperature, the maid offered drinks, but Hanny suddenly refused. She asked to cool the infusion a little more, which the empress found funny. So, Melissa decided to try it first, but suddenly the princess screamed and jumped up. The maid and the empress looked at her confused, surprised by that reaction. Not wanting to wait any longer, the protagonist took a silver watch out of her pocket. Then, he began to immerse it intensely in the cup with the infusion, hoping that the silver would reveal whether there was poison. Melissa, not understanding anything, looked at the maid, who had an imperturbable expression. At that moment, the maid began to suspect the little one. When she took the watch out of the cup, Hanny, to her surprise, saw that it was in perfect condition. Then, the maid burst out laughing, thinking that the princess was having nightmares again. But suddenly the girl asked the maid to give her a handkerchief. The girl did not understand why, but the protagonist began to insist. Annie knew that checking the poison in such a way was pointless. I'm sure the maid did something at the place where the cup touches the lips. As he wiped first the cup, and then the watch with a handkerchief, both began to darken rapidly before his eyes. It was now an indisputable fact that there was poison in the cup, and the girl turned her gaze to the empress. Melissa's face was filled with terror, and she couldn't take her eyes off the clock. At the same instant, the maid sharply grabbed Hanny's hand and pulled it with all her might. After that, he threw the girl to the ground, making the empress jump up. The maid was furious, not understanding how that brat could find out. Suddenly, she lifted up her skirt, took out a knife tied to her leg, and apologized in advance to the empress. Melissa looked in horror at the maid, who had worked for her longer than the others, refusing to believe what was happening. The maid screamed, because she never wanted things to go this far. The protagonist understood that it was already too late to try to stop the killer, and the guards had not yet arrived. The only option was to use the girl's ice power. There was no other way out, and the protagonist began to concentrate ice magic in her hand. He then created an ice spear, preparing to freeze the assassin. At the same instant, the door burst open, and on the threshold appeared the gentleman, led by Captain Drake. The maid was ordered to drop the gun immediately, and raise her hands above her head. Knowing that the maid was still dangerous, the girl quickly ran and pushed her. Because of the surprise, the girl immediately fell to the ground and the knife fell out of her hand. She looked angrily at the protagonist, enraged because of that brat. But at that very moment, several knights' swords aimed directly at the assassin, leaving her no chance to move. The Empress looked confused at her maid, who had been the slowest so far. Loyal, Hani and Melissa watched as the gentleman took the criminal away, who started screaming hysterically and struggling. At the same moment, the Emperor entered, looking frightened at the Empress and the princess. The first thing he wanted was to make sure the girls hadn't been hurt. Seeing that they were safe and sound, Frederick hugged his wife and his little sister tightly. Now, the Empress could not stay in that palace, and had to go to the doctor as soon as possible. And Nilos looked uncomfortable, wanting to tell the Empress something, but suddenly, Melissa interrupted her mid-sentence, and hugged her tightly and tenderly. The Empress also had a lot of questions, but she understood that the little one just wanted to protect her. Therefore, although Hani's actions were reckless, the Empress thanked him for his bravery, and for saving her. The heroine was also glad that she managed to stop the killer, but now she felt an incredible tension from the Emperor. Suddenly, Frederick decided that now it was the princess's turn, which sent a shiver through her. He did not understand how she knew who the culprit was, what poison was, and why she decided to act alone. Then the heroine asked if the Emperor knew that lately she was falling asleep anywhere. Frederica felt, thinking that it was because of the high fever, but it turned out that that was just an excuse, because the girl could tell that every night she had nightmares in which Melissa fainted from the poison. For that very reason, he went for a walk at night, to calm his anxiety. Besides, he thought that his forebodings were just a coincidence, and everything else he wrote in a letter. Annie did not deny her guilt, but she wanted to go to the Emperor as soon as she found any clues about the culprit. At first he thought it was just a nightmare. Then, he began to suspect the maidens, and then noticed a lot of strange things. There was no way to act fast, because that maiden was always nearby, so the girl decided to send a letter. But the maid still managed to prepare the brevity, so the protagonist decided to stop her. Annie started shaking and crying as she realized the danger she had exposed the Empress to. However, Frederick did not want her to blame herself. Besides, Melissa was also grateful to him. A great misfortune could have really happened, so the Emperor personally thanked the protagonist. To his surprise, the girl decided that she would rather not hear those words again. After all, he was only protecting his beloved family, and was not doing it to receive thanks. Shocked by those words, Frederick apologized, and promised not to say it again, knowing that it had been difficult enough for the little one to do everything alone. He decided to send her to rest. Meanwhile, the gentleman arrived with the report that they had found evidence in the kitchen. The Emperor thought that was not for a girl's ears, so he asked Drake to take her with him. Later, Agnes came to the kitchen, and after analyzing the poison, she found that the symptoms appeared only after an incubation period. It has no color, no smell, no clear symptoms that distinguish it from other poisons. If the Empress had ingested the poison, neither she nor anyone else would have noticed the poisoning. There wouldn't have been any evidence left, so even Agnes wouldn't have been able to identify the poison or do anything. After that, for a few seconds, a tense silence filled the air. Frederick understood that if that poison was so difficult to detect, it could already be anywhere in the palace. Therefore, the palace had to be closed as soon as possible, and the imperial family evacuated. However, Agnes and Drake also knew that a simple maid could not have gotten that poison alone. What if the culprit was now not only going after Melissa, but also after the entire imperial family? Meanwhile, Viola was receiving the lady at the palace, having already heard what had happened. Now, I wanted the protagonist to change her clothes as soon as possible, and get a good rest from everything. At that moment, the servants announced that Fedora had arrived to see the princess. The maid looked at Viola uncertainly, wanting to tell something to Hani. Suddenly, he fell to his knees and bowed down to the ground, leaving the girls confused. The maid never imagined that this woman would threaten Mrs. Melissa. He also understood that this was a mortal sin, that it could not be forgiven. However, Fedora's little sisters were not to blame, and she started begging to be protected. The princess had no intention of questioning her. I just wanted to hear everything I knew. It turned out that Fedora was just an observer, and if they failed, she had to commit the murder herself. She did not want to do it at all, but her father left her no other choice. The maid who tried to poison the lady didn't know anything about Fedora, or who was behind it. Hani assumed that it could be the Terrence family, which caused the maid to become paralyzed with fear. However, she did not want to say anything, understanding that the little one could not stand it. At that moment, Hani remembered that she was still a young princess, young and defenseless. No matter what happened, the little girl promised to protect Fedora's brothers, asking in return that everything be reported to the emperor. The girl was very grateful to the princess for trusting her and for listening to her. The next day, Frederick ordered the palace to be closed, and the entire royal family evacuated. Melissa, Oswald and Constance immediately left for a mansion far from the family. After that, an investigation among the palace staff immediately began, as Hani was one of the main witnesses. The emperor decided to keep her a little to talk to her. After all, I wanted to understand how it was that the little girl discovered the culprit. The thing was, that maid checked the princess's hands to make sure she was right-handed. As soon as we entered the room, she prepared the infusion in a cup with a handle, and there Hani understood everything. The assassin decided to take advantage of the fact that the empress was holding the cup with her left hand instead of her right. There was no poison in the infusion, but the maid watched where Melissa brought the cup to her mouth. That same cup was on the table, and Hani pointed with his finger to the place where the poison was. The protagonist did not check it, but she was sure that the same thing could happen with other cups. That was all the princess knew, and the emperor asked Captain Drake to verify the information. Soon, all the words of the protagonist were completely confirmed, leaving Frederick amazed. He of course knew that Hani was smart, but he couldn't imagine how much. Thinking that she was just like him, the emperor stroked the girl's head. Seeing Drake's smile, Frederick didn't understand why the captain had such a cheeky look. On top of everything, I was terrified that the poison would be found in the box that Christopher had sent. It seems that the criminal wanted not only to frame the Duke, but to use the little one to divert suspicion. If we assume that Melissa took the poison, and Hani didn't know anything, then there would be a lot of suspects. That maid would be the first suspect, but she would be exculpated immediately for whatever the princess said. She would claim that she did not put the poison, and Hani would confirm it. That's why he gave the girl a taste first. Suddenly, the little girl decided to tell Frederick another important detail. The emperor was shocked, not understanding where his little sister was getting so much information. The protagonist told the emperor in full detail everything related to Fedora. Frederick really appreciated the information she gave him, but he was very worried that the little girl was so involved in all this. If all that was true, then whoever was behind this controlled the people around. The first thing was to approach Fedora and find out as much as possible about her. It was clear that the situation was serious, but now the emperor decided to be more attentive than ever. She still wasn't recovering from yesterday, when the criminal revealed who the client was. To Hani's surprise, the customer turned out to be her mother Eleonora, which made the little girl paralyzed. However, since Eleonora was dead, it was unlikely that she would directly influence, although perhaps she was still involved in some way. The protagonist understood that, unlike the poison her mother got, this one was different, so someone else had gotten it. At that moment, Hani remembered the unexpected encounter with Terrence in the forest at night. They searched the killer's room and found evidence of that deal. Now all that remained was to discover the connection with Eleonora. We had to be very careful until we found the culprit, and in the meantime, the emperor decided to punish the woman's family. The little girl was afraid that maybe Eleonora would act without the help of her family, but Frederick was sure that they were also involved. His family were ruined aristocrats who lived off their modest fortune. After Eleonora's death, their bond with the emperor was broken, and they began to engage in illegal activities. All that time, the emperor had turned a blind eye, but it was time to do justice. Frederick knew that such news could affect Hani, so he wanted her to leave for the mansion the next day. The next day, the emperor sentenced the murderer to death and stripped Eleonora's family of their status and assets. A day later, when the news of what had happened came out, the whole empire was in a state of revolution. Frederick stared in horror at the burning headlines, completely bewildered. As I thought, the public opinion about Hani was not the best, so she had to be sent immediately to the mansion. While packing her things, Viola did not understand why the princess, who had saved the empress's life, had to flee, but Hani herself had no problem, since her family was in the mansion. In addition, the area where the mansion was located was famous for its breathtaking landscapes. Looking at the maid, the protagonist could not imagine the shock Melissa had suffered after the betrayal of her closest maid. When the carriage was ready, the things packed, and the girls started to get in, Drake knocked on the door suddenly. The captain's face was marked by horror, which left both protagonists in shock. First of all, he made sure that the little one was feeling well, especially after the night before. Drake sighed with relief to know that, after yesterday's encounter, Honey had returned safely to her room. To the horror of the princess, it turned out that last night Fedora had suddenly disappeared. She had been arrested as a suspect, and was waiting to be questioned. But when they went to see her in the morning, there was no trace of the maid left. Now they were looking for her everywhere, and since the last person she saw before being detained was Honey, Drake decided to come here. The Emperor even called Fedora's father for this, suspecting that his family might be involved in the escape. The little girl was sure that the maiden had not disappeared of her own free will, at which Drake sighed heavily. He also thought that the real author had deleted Fedora to hide the truth. After the conversation, the captain hurried to send the protagonist to the mansion, escorted by gentlemen. The girl was wondering if that was exactly what Fedora was afraid of, or if she had really just escaped. Arriving at the mansion, Honey wondered what everyone was doing at such late hours. Near the map, they were received by Charles, whom the protagonist had not seen for a long time, and wanted to know where the others were. The head butler apologized for what he was going to say, and it turned out that Mrs. Melissa had had a miscarriage. Annie stood paralyzed, her eyes wide open, while Viola covered her face with fright. Everything happened suddenly and very soon. His Highness was to arrive here. Releasing Viola's hand, the girl ran out to the mansion, but suddenly the forces abandoned her, and she dropped on the way, plunged into deep despair. Charles personally accompanied the protagonists to the house. In an atmosphere of funeral silence, as they entered the room, they saw Agnes, Constance, Oswald and Christopher standing by Melissa's bed. The Empress lay with her eyes closed, and her face, always radiant, was duller than ever. The Emperor's mother pulled Honey and Oswald closer to her, hugging them with her arms. The doctor did everything she could, relieving the belly pain and stopping the bleeding. Constance did not understand, because recently Agnes assured that Melissa and the grandson were fine. However, the abortion may have occurred due to stress, although sometimes it happens for no apparent reason. The only thing the healer was sure of was that the poison had nothing to do with this.